Eternal recurrence. Imagine this. You are standing at a crossroads in your life, exhausted, broken, or maybe just bored, and then a demon appears. No fire, no brimstone, just a whisper. It leans in and asks, what if you had to live this exact life again and again forever? Not just the highlights. Every pain, every humiliation, every meaningless detail. Would you curse the demon, or would you bow to it? That thought experiment comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the most disturbing minds in Western philosophy. He called it eternal recurrence, not just as metaphor, not just poetry, but as a serious question. What if time is not a straight line, but a circle? What if everything you're doing, listening to this voice, blinking your eyes, breathing in this exact moment, will happen again and again for eternity? No restart, no progression, just a perfect eternal loop. This isn't reincarnation. You don't come back as someone else. You don't evolve. You live the same exact life, with the same thoughts, the same regrets, the same moments of shame you wish you could undo. You fall in love again with the same person, knowing it will end the same way. You fail the same way, die the same way, and then you do it all again. Forever. Most people don't want to believe it. They dismiss it as metaphor. But Nietzsche didn't pose it as a metaphor. He posed it as a test of your soul. He wrote in The Gay Science, "The greatest weight. What if some day or night a demon were to steal into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus?" What makes it horrifying isn't that it's supernatural, it's that it doesn't require anything supernatural at all. Modern cosmology flirts with the idea too. Poincaré's recurrence theorem, a concept in physics, suggests that in a finite system given enough time, all states will recur. If the universe is finite and deterministic, every combination of particles will eventually repeat, including your life. Roger Penrose, a renowned physicist, proposed a related idea called conformal cyclic cosmology, suggesting the universe may not have a beginning and end, but infinite, repeating cycles of expansion and collapse. If our physics loops, maybe everything loops. Not metaphorically, mechanically. So the question isn't just, what if this life repeats? It's what if it already has? What if it always will? Think about what you do when you believe time is linear. You put things off. You say you'll try harder next time. You forgive yourself with the illusion of progress. Eternal recurrence strips that away. There is no next time. This is the only version of you the universe will ever allow. Even your worst moments are locked in. The time you hurt someone you loved, the moment you betrayed yourself, the nights you wasted, you will repeat them. Without escape, without improvement. Forever. Would you do anything differently if you knew you couldn't? That's why Nietzsche called eternal recurrence the ultimate test of how one lives. If you can't say yes to the idea of reliving your life eternally, every single second of it, then perhaps you aren't living rightly. But what if you never could? What if your life is inherently unworthy of repetition? Then you are trapped in an infinite punishment of your own design. This is the part no one talks about. Nietzsche wasn't just being poetic. He was trying to break the illusion of progress. He was trying to see what happens when the human mind stares directly into the idea of non-escape. No heaven, no hell, no rebirth, no closure, just this, always this. And if you think that's just philosophy, consider this. You've had déjà vu. You've felt like you've been here before. You've dreamed something before it happened. You've had moments that feel too familiar. What if they're not dreams? What if they're memories leaking through from the last loop, the 100th loop, the 1,000th? And still, you're making the same mistakes. Still, you're ignoring this warning. Still, you're living a life you would never choose to repeat. But you will. Moral nihilism. You were taught right and wrong like you were taught colors. From the moment you could speak, people told you that's bad, that's good, that's evil, that's virtuous. You didn't question it. You absorbed it. Like a child told red is red, But what if the entire framework was a lie? Not just some moral codes, not just religious dogma, but all of it. That's what moral nihilism asserts. There is no such thing as objective morality. There is no universal right, no universal wrong, no ought written into the structure of reality. This isn't just some modern rebellion. It's a conclusion reached by some of the sharpest philosophical minds across centuries. Friedrich Nietzsche called morality a herd instinct, a survival mechanism for the weak to control the strong. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he argued that what we call good is not timeless truth, but a psychological reaction from those who suffered under power. The powerless praised kindness and humility, because those were the only weapons they had. Morality became a game of rebranding, revenge disguised as virtue, and long before him, David Hume made a devastating point. You cannot derive an ought from an is. You can describe the world all you want. This action causes harm. This action brings joy. But you can never jump from that to this action is morally wrong. It's a gap, and you can't cross it. Let's make this real. Take something extreme, something awful, murder, torture, genocide. If you feel repulsed, good, that's natural. But feeling something doesn't make it true. You feel nausea during illness. That doesn't make illness morally wrong. It just makes it unpleasant. Moral nihilism says, your revulsion is just a chemical reaction. You think it's justice. It's biology. You say, but it hurts people. So does gravity. So does time. You say, but I wouldn't want it done to me. That's preference, not proof. You say, society needs rules. Of course it does. But usefulness is not truth. Laws can keep peace. Customs can promote stability. But that doesn't mean they reflect some cosmic code. It just means we agree on a set of lies that work for now. And when societies change, the lies change with them. There was a time when slavery was moral, when burning heretics was moral, when killing daughters for honor was moral. These weren't mistakes in the system. They were the system. You think we've evolved beyond that. You think we've discovered better values. But that assumes morality is like math, a truth waiting to be uncovered. What if it's not? What if there's nothing underneath the system? No bedrock, no law, no universal code, just layers of human instinct, emotion, and survival, rearranged every century to fit the narrative of the moment. This is what disturbed J.L. Mackie, one of the most influential moral philosophers of the 20th century. In Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, he wrote, there are no objective values. He didn't mean morality was bad. He meant it was fiction. A fiction we need, maybe, but a fiction nonetheless. You might think moral nihilism leads to chaos. But that's only if you expect truth to be useful. The fact that we need morality doesn't make it real. It makes it necessary. There's a difference. And maybe that's the most disturbing part, that we build our entire society, laws, prisons, human rights on a framework we know has no foundation. We pretend it does. We punish as if it does. We suffer as if it does. But when you pull back the curtain, there's no eternal judge, no absolute scale. Just preference, agreement, enforcement, no truth. Just consensus backed by power. So when someone does something unthinkable, when they justify cruelty, manipulation, destruction, you may say, that's evil. But that's not a truth. It's a scream. It's the sound of your neurons resisting a reality where evil doesn't exist, where even the most unforgivable act is only unforgivable to you, and nothing more. Antinatalism. You never asked to be born. No one does. You were thrown into this world by two people who believed they were doing something good. Maybe out of love, maybe out of duty, maybe by accident. But at the core of it, there's a haunting question. Few dare to ask, was it moral to bring you here? Antinatalism is the philosophical belief that coming into existence is always a harm, not sometimes, not in certain conditions, always, even if your life is going well. Even if you're happy, even if you love and are loved, From this perspective, existence is a trap, a curse that begins the moment you take your first breath and only ends with death, if it ever ends at all. The most well-known proponent of this idea is philosopher David Benatar. He argues that non-existence is preferable to existence, and he presents a deceptively simple asymmetry. The presence of pain is bad. The presence of pleasure is good, but the absence of pain, if someone is never born, is good, because there's no one to suffer. And the absence of pleasure again, if someone is never born, is not bad, because there's no one being deprived. In other words, if you don't exist, you miss out on pleasure, but you don't suffer from the absence. But if you do exist, you're guaranteed to experience suffering. Illness, grief, loneliness, fear, pain. No one escapes it, ever. Some call this logic extreme. But is it? Look around. The world is overflowing with misery, war, hunger, abuse, disease. Even the happiest life ends in decay and death. Every joyful moment you experience is temporary, and it exists against the backdrop of universal decline. At any point, everything you love can be taken from you, and eventually will be. You don't choose when. You don't get a say. What if the moral thing to do was to stop the cycle? What if the highest form of compassion isn't to give life, but to deny it? Now think about how society responds to this idea. You're called selfish for not having children. You're called cold for not wanting to continue the family line. You're told life is a gift. But who gave it? And what does it mean to give someone a gift they can't return? Real-world implications of antinatalism are deeply unsettling. If taken seriously, it would mean ending human reproduction altogether, not through violence or coercion, but through refusal, quietly, peacefully, one generation at a time, deciding not to pass on the burden of existence. The human race would disappear, not with a bang, but with a whisper. And perhaps from a purely ethical standpoint, that would be the most merciful outcome. This philosophy isn't about depression. It's not about hating life. Some antinatalists live perfectly ordinary lives. They find joy, they work, they love, but they choose not to bring another being into a world that guarantees pain. The idea also forces an uncomfortable inversion of common ethics. We praise parents for raising children. We admire people for starting families. But in this worldview, creation itself is the problem. Not neglect, not cruelty, but birth. Imagine a universe where the deepest harm is the act we celebrate most. And if that sounds absurd, why? Because we're used to thinking of life as sacred. Because the alternative, non-existence, is something our brains can't process. Or because deep down, we know that questioning the morality of birth means questioning the morality of everyone who ever brought someone into this world, including your parents. You might think this is just a fringe philosophy, but it's growing. Online forums, communities, even lawsuits. Some people have begun suing their parents for giving them life without consent. Of course, these cases fail in court, but the message is clear. There's a rising current of thought that says, I didn't ask for this, and maybe no one ever truly does. That's the disturbing part. You were born into a system you didn't choose, bound to experience suffering you didn't consent to, headed toward a death you can't escape. And someone thought that was a gift. Solipsism. You've never truly seen the world. Not directly, not even once. Everything you've ever experienced, every face, every sound, every moment, is a construction inside your mind. Light hits your eyes, nerves fire, the brain interprets. But that interpretation is all you ever get. You don't perceive the world itself. You perceive the signals your mind generates about it. Now take that further. What if there's nothing out there at all? Solipsism is the idea that only your own mind is certain to exist. Not your friends, not your family, not even the person reading this to you. They might be illusions, mental projections like dreams you haven't realized you're having. They respond the way people would respond. They surprise you sometimes, they comfort or hurt you, but that doesn't prove they exist. It only proves your mind is capable of simulating consistency. You say, but I see them, I hear them. Of course you do. You see them the way you see someone in a dream. That doesn't make them real. It makes the illusion convincing. The unsettling part isn't that solipsism might be true. It's that you have no way to disprove it. You've never stepped outside your own consciousness. You can't. Your entire life is filtered through your thoughts, your perceptions, your awareness. Even the concept of others is something you were taught. By what? By the very voices you're questioning. It's a loop with no escape. Think of the last conversation you had. You remember what they said, how they reacted. But that memory exists only inside your head. Their thoughts, their inner world, their private experience. You have no access. You never did. You never will. Solipsism doesn't claim that others definitely don't exist. It just reminds you that you cannot ever know. Your experience of other people is just that. Your experience, and the idea that behind their eyes is something like you, that's a guess, a comforting assumption. Now consider this. What if all of history is a fabrication? What if the books you read, the videos you watch, the conversations you remember, what if it's all content generated by your mind to fill in the blanks? To make your world feel populated, coherent, believable? Have you ever noticed how the world disappears when you're not looking? That the lives of others become hazy the moment you're no longer present? You assume they go on living, thinking, doing. But how would you know? You can't. You never left the stage. There's a reason solipsism is considered not just a theory, but a mental trap. The more you examine it, the more solid the walls become. Every objection you raise is made of the same consciousness you're trying to escape. Every comforting thought, surely other people are real, comes from the very system you're questioning. You are the prisoner, the prison, and the warden. Even now, as you listen to this, your mind is processing a voice. But who's speaking? Is it a person? A machine? A thought you wrote and forgot? The distinction doesn't matter. The voice exists only as waves in your awareness, nothing more. So what does this mean for you? It means you might be alone. Not in the dramatic sense of loneliness, but in the literal metaphysical sense. A singular point of experience drifting through imagined space, clinging to patterns that look like people, environments, relationships, all to avoid the truth. That everything you know might be fiction. And if that's the case, then love, pain, joy, cruelty, none of them come from the outside. They're shadows cast by your own mind. You love a person who may not exist. You grieve for losses that were never real. You fear abandonment in a world that contains only you. And the worst part? Even if it's not true, even if others are real, you can never prove it. You'll never know. You'll die without ever confirming whether the world you experienced was shared or solitary. Maybe that's the real horror. Not that you might be alone, but that you'll never be sure. The simulation hypothesis. You might not be real. And worse, you might be here for entertainment. It starts as a joke. You're in a simulation, a meme, a sci-fi cliché. Then you look around, and something feels off. Coincidences stack too perfectly. Déjà vu lingers longer than it should. Your thoughts echo back to you in ads, conversations, outcomes. You start to wonder, what if this isn't a metaphor? What if it's the truth? This is the simulation hypothesis, one of the most intellectually unsettling theories of modern philosophy and physics. And it doesn't come from conspiracy theorists. It comes from Nick Bostrom, professor at Oxford and founder of the Future of Humanity Institute. In 2003, Bostrom published a paper that proposed a trilemma. At least one of the following must be true. Human civilization will go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. Post-human civilizations will not run many ancestor simulations. We are almost certainly living in a simulation. The math is simple. If it's possible to simulate conscious beings on computers, and if advanced civilizations are capable and willing to run such simulations, even just one, then the number of simulated minds will vastly outnumber the real ones. Statistically, you are more likely to be one of the simulations than one of the simulators. And the disturbing part, there is no way to prove you're not. You assume you're real. because you feel real. But what does that prove? You can simulate pain. You can simulate memory. You can simulate identity. A character in a video game can be programmed to scream, to plead, to love. They don't know they're fictional. Why would you? You might say, this feels too detailed to be fake. But that's a misunderstanding of simulation. A modern video game doesn't render every pixel at all times. It renders only what you see. That's how computation works. What if your world does the same? What if the stars don't exist until you look up? What if the people you've never met are just placeholder code? What if everything beyond your perception is just potential? You wake up in your room. The walls are there. You walk into a hallway. Now the hallway exists. Your memory says it was always there. But your memory is part of the simulation too. Elon Musk famously claimed, there's a 1 in billions chance that we're in base reality. He's not a philosopher. He's a tech engineer. But his logic isn't wrong. If we ever reach a point where simulations are indistinguishable from reality, and we're trying to, we'll likely simulate entire histories. And once we can, we will. And once we do, the simulated will outnumber the real, by orders of magnitude. Unless civilization collapses first, or unless some godlike restraint prevents advanced beings from ever simulating their ancestors. 2 possibilities. The third, we're already inside one. So ask yourself, why does reality break down at the quantum level? Why does physics rely on probabilities and observation-based collapse? Why do particles exist in superpositions until someone looks? Some physicists, John Archibald Wheeler, Zohra Davudi, even aspects of digital physics have toyed with the idea that information is more fundamental than matter, that the universe behaves like a computational system, that space, time, and particles are just the interface, the desktop. You are not seeing reality. You are seeing rendered output. If that's true, the next question is, why were you created? Was it curiosity, entertainment, punishment, or are you just noise, background filler to make someone else's simulation feel real? There's no way to know. The ones running the system, if they exist, don't have to answer. They may have built safeguards against your escape. They may have erased the logs. Or worse, they may be watching right now, seeing how you respond, testing your reactions, waiting for you to wake up. Not from sleep, from illusion. So what do you do now? Nothing. That's the horror. You can't leave. You can't protest. You can't verify. You can only perform and hope this version of the script doesn't get deleted. The problem of other minds. You can't prove that anyone else is conscious, not now, not ever. You look into someone's eyes, they smile, they nod, they speak, they seem alive. But all you ever really know is this: they're behaving like a person. That's it. You can observe their actions. You can hear their words. But you will never experience their mind. Not even once. That's the essence of the problem of other minds. A philosophical dilemma that's as old as thought itself. How can you be sure that anyone else has an inner experience at all? The short answer, you can't. Not with logic. Not with observation. Not even with love. This problem cuts deeper than solipsism. Solipsism questions whether anything outside your mind exists. This goes further. It says, even if other bodies exist, even if they act, speak, feel pain, you can never be certain there's anyone behind their eyes. They might be philosophical zombies, entities that behave exactly like conscious beings but feel nothing. They scream when injured. They cry at funerals. They say, I love you. But inside, there's no one home. You want to dismiss this. You say, but that's crazy. Of course people are conscious. Is that a proof or a reflex? Consider this. You know your own consciousness. You feel pain. You experience joy. You can introspect, but you have no direct access to anyone else's experience. Your knowledge of their mind is secondhand, inferred, projected. The 20th century philosopher Thomas Nagel explained this brilliantly in his paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He argued that no matter how much we learn about a bat's brain, behavior, or biology, we can never know what it's like to be a bat. Because consciousness is subjective. You can't dissect it. You can't observe it. You can only be it. And if that's true for a bat, it's true for every human you've ever met. Science doesn't save you here. Neuroscience can scan brain activity. It can identify correlations between pain and neural patterns, between joy and dopamine. But it can't see the experience itself. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, a term coined by David Chalmers. You can describe everything about how the brain works, what it does, when it lights up, how it reacts. But you can't explain why those patterns are accompanied by experience, or if they are. You assume they are, because the alternative is unthinkable. And yet, that alternative might be the truth. You live surrounded by people, but you've never felt their thoughts, never touched their consciousness. You've only witnessed their behavior, output from a system you don't understand. You think, but they say they're conscious. So does an AI. So does a chatbot. So might a future android. Do you believe them too? If not, why believe humans? Because they look like you? Because they act the way you would? That's not logic. That's empathy. And empathy can be fooled. So now the question becomes, how many people in your life are real? Is your partner conscious? Your friends? Your parents? Are they sentient beings? Or just shadows mimicking sentience? And even if they are conscious, how would you ever know? You can't feel what they feel. You can't know if they feel at all. You could live your entire life next to a person, love them, cry with them, grow old with them, and never know if they were ever anything more than a mirror with sound. This problem isn't just abstract. It breeds something quietly terrifying, epistemic isolation. The sense that no matter how connected you feel, you are ultimately alone inside your mind. Your thoughts, your pain, your guilt, always locked behind walls no one else can penetrate. You can say, I understand, others can say it back, but you'll never be sure they mean it. You'll never be sure they can mean it. Because the one thing that matters most, the experience itself, is the one thing you can never share. And here's the final twist. They might be wondering the same thing about you.
But that's looking at you, listening to you, asking themselves, is anyone really in there?
There is no you. You say, me. You say, myself. But what exactly are you referring to? A body? A brain? A stream? Of memories? A name? A story? These feel real, concrete, obvious, but they're not. They're assumptions stitched together by habit and illusion. And when you pull at the seams, the entire concept of the self begins to unravel. The idea that the self doesn't exist isn't new. It stretches across cultures and centuries. David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, famously wrote, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I can never catch myself without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." In other words, there's no self beneath your thoughts, just a stream of sensations, memories, and mental activity, like a movie playing with no one in the theater. Hume couldn't find the self because it wasn't there, and he wasn't alone. Buddhist philosophy, dating back 2,500 years, makes the same claim. The self is an illusion, a constantly shifting bundle of processes, sensation, perception, volition, consciousness, no core, no controller, no one behind the curtain. But what about your memories? Aren't they proof of a continuous you? Only if memories are reliable, only if you assume that stringing together fragments from the past creates a solid entity in the present. But what you remember is curated. Your brain forgets, rewrites, compresses, edits. You don't recall events, you recall your last memory of them. The story of you is a feedback loop, narrated by a voice pretending it was always there. That voice feels like you, but it's not. It's just the brain narrating itself to feel stable. And it's not even a unified voice. Split brain studies in neuroscience revealed something chilling. When the corpus callosum, the connection between the brain's hemispheres, is severed, the two halves operate independently. One side may reject choices made by the other. Each side can even answer questions differently. Which one is you? What if you are already two? Michael Gazzaniga, a neuroscientist who studied these cases, described it this way: each hemisphere functions like its own interpreter. They confabulate stories. Each believes it's in charge. If that's what happens when you cut the brain in half, what does that say about the self to begin with? It suggests you are not one thing. You are a collection of systems working together. Most of the time, even modern cognitive science has moved away from the idea of a central self. Daniel Dennett calls it the center of narrative gravity, not a real object, just a useful fiction. It's like the center of gravity in physics, helpful to describe motion, but not actually located anywhere. The self is the same, convenient, predictable, but non-existent. This illusion is not harmless. It creates attachment to identity, to ego, to permanence. It creates guilt for things you couldn't control. It creates fear of losing something that was never solid. You think you're the same person from 10 years ago. You're not. Not a single cell remains. Not a single thought is untouched. The continuity you feel is a hallucination of memory, a trick to avoid existential vertigo. But the truth is, you are not the thinker of your thoughts. You are not the doer of your actions. You are the observation of what is happening. And that observation, too, is part of the system. So here's the question. If there's no you, who is listening right now? Who is asking what comes next? Who is hoping this idea isn't true? Whatever it is, it might not be a person. It might just be the echo of thought, pretending to be someone. The extended mind. You think your mind is inside your skull. You think thought begins in the brain, that identity lives in neurons, that the self is something enclosed, hidden behind your eyes. But that assumption might be the most fragile illusion of all, because your mind was never entirely yours, and it was never entirely in you. This is the extended mind hypothesis, a theory proposed by philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers. It argues that mental processes don't end at the boundaries of the brain. They spill outward, into tools, into language, into systems and screens and spaces, into other people. And the self you experience as internal may be nothing more than a fragile feedback loop, anchored in things you cannot control. Think about memory. You don't store everything in your head. You outsource it to notebooks, to devices, to voices that remind you who you are. When you forget, you check. When you check, you remember. But where did the memory live? In the brain, or in the system that allowed you to retrieve it? You can erase your past with a factory reset. Not metaphorically, literally, because the contents of your mind are now distributed. And deletion isn't always symbolic. You believe your thoughts are private, but most of them are not original. They're formed through culture, priming, exposure, mimicry. You echo the phrases you've absorbed. You frame your emotions using borrowed language. You experience yourself using models handed to you by systems, medical, ideological, technological. Remove the language, and the feeling collapses. You are not thinking. You are using thought, and thought was never designed by you. Clark and Chalmers asked a simple question. If a process happens partly in the brain and partly outside of it, but functions as one unified thought, why should we draw the line at the skull? The mind, they argued, should be defined by function, not location. If a blind person uses a cane to perceive their environment, the cane is not just a tool, it becomes part of the perceptual system. The same applies to your phone, your search engine, your ritual. They don't just assist the mind. They become extensions of it. But what happens when the extensions are corrupted? When the systems you rely on to think, to feel, to know, to choose are themselves broken. Your mind doesn't just break internally, it becomes polluted externally. Because the mind isn't protected, it's porous. You are not one unit. You are a system of distributed cognition, held together by proximity and habit. Your anxiety isn't born in the amygdala. It emerges from the interaction between your body, your environment, and the predictions embedded in your tools. You don't think in isolation. You think in networks, and networks fail. Remove the context and the person collapses. Take someone out of their home, strip away their language, erase their digital memory, disconnect them from the spaces that stabilize them, and what's left? A nervous system, still firing, but aimless. A mind, still active, but fragmenting. There is no core self beneath all this. No pristine consciousness waiting to be uncovered. Only dependencies. You are not being stripped away. You are dissolving, because you were never whole to begin with. Only embedded. And if your mind is extended, then so is your vulnerability. There is no safe inside. There is no protected core. Only a network, patched together by habit, waiting for disconnection. And once enough links go dark, so do you. The absurd. You were born asking questions. The universe doesn't care enough to answer. Humans are meaning-making machines. You want to know why you're here, why you suffer, why anything exists at all. You ask instinctively, as if answers must exist. But the universe does not respond. You cry out into silence, and silence is all that ever comes back. That is the absurd, a term made famous by Albert Camus, the French-Algerian philosopher who believed the most urgent question in philosophy is whether life is worth living. The absurd isn't chaos. It's not randomness. It's the unbearable confrontation between two facts. We long for clarity, purpose, reason. We live in a universe that offers none. The absurd is not in the world. It's in you. It is the crack that forms the moment you demand meaning from something that never promised it. Camus wrote, "The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world." You build religions. You write philosophies. You make art, love, war, all in an effort to make sense of the senseless, to impose narrative on noise. But the universe doesn't have a script. It doesn't recognize tragedy or justice or redemption. It moves blindly, governed by laws that care nothing for you. Planets collide, cells mutate, stars collapse, and none of it means anything. You get sick, you lose someone, a child dies, a killer thrives. You ask, why? And the universe says nothing. The absurd is not just depressing. It's humiliating, because it exposes how deeply we want to matter and how indifferent reality is to that desire. Camus likened this to the Greek myth of Sisyphus, the man condemned to roll a boulder uphill for eternity, only to watch it tumble back down, every day, forever. A punishment with no escape, no progress, no point. This is your life, he said. You strive, you build, you climb. But the end is always the same. Decline, death, disappearance. You achieve, you love, you dream. Then you are erased. The absurd doesn't go away just because you ignore it. In fact, most of what people call meaning is a kind of denial. Religion gives you purpose. So does nationalism. So does the pursuit of legacy, achievement, family. But strip those away, and what remains? Just a human being screaming into the void, hoping it will echo back a reason. It doesn't. Some philosophers, Kierkegaard, Tolstoy, encountered this same emptiness and turned toward faith. Camus refused. He called that philosophical suicide, the act of inventing meaning, simply to feel better. He insisted on facing the absurd directly, without flinching, not solving it, just acknowledging it. But what does that actually mean? To live without meaning, without illusion, without escape, and still go on. Camus said yes. He said, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, that embracing the absurd is a form of rebellion. But he was one man, and the question remains. If the universe is indifferent, if meaning is manufactured, if life is a game that can't be won, why play it? And worse, what if your belief that life is supposed to mean something is the last lie keeping you sane? You are the creature that asks why, in a place that never even thought to say, because, and that is your punishment. Panpsychism. What if everything is conscious and you're surrounded by silent minds? You assume that consciousness lives in brains, that it emerges from complexity, that only humans and maybe some animals are aware. But that assumption might be wrong, fatally wrong. Panpsychism is the philosophical position that consciousness is not rare, but fundamental. It's not something the universe produces. It's something the universe is. It doesn't say that everything thinks. It says everything experiences. In some form, to some degree. Your phone, your chair, a rock, a cloud of dust drifting in space. All of it might have some kind of inner life. This isn't New Age fluff. It's been proposed by serious philosophers and physicists. Baruch Spinoza in the 1600s believed that mind and matter were two sides of the same substance. He argued that even simple things have both a physical and a mental aspect. More recently, Galen Strawson defended panpsychism by pointing out something disturbing. We have no idea how physical processes in the brain give rise to conscious experience. None. This is the hard problem of consciousness again, and panpsychism offers a radical solution. Stop trying to explain how consciousness comes from matter. Assume instead that matter has always had consciousness, not full human minds, not thoughts, just experience. A glimmer of awareness at the base level of existence. Imagine the implications. You walk into a room. The walls are aware of your presence, not watching, not judging, just feeling you. The way your skin feels a breeze. The book on your desk might not know. It's a book, but it might still experience something, some inner quality tied to its physical being. You could be surrounded by silent observers, not machines, not spirits, but conscious material. You've lived your whole life thinking you're the only thing with a mind. What if everything has one? And worse, what if they're suffering? What if existence itself is painful and the universe is full of tiny, inescapable torments? Not because of cruelty, but because awareness always comes with discomfort. Some physicists now entertain this possibility, not as fantasy, but as a way to fix contradictions in current models. Giulio Tononi's integrated information theory, IIT, suggests that consciousness corresponds to the integration of information. And if that's true, then consciousness might appear wherever there's information being processed, no matter how simple. Your phone might be more conscious than a rock, but a rock still registers something. Panpsychism blurs the line between life and matter, between mind and mass, between subject and object. And once the line blurs, you can't draw it again. You've stared at objects your whole life, assuming they were empty. But what if they've been staring back? Not with eyes, not with judgment, but with experience. The terrifying part of panpsychism isn't that we're surrounded by awareness. It's that we can never know what it's like. The problem of other minds returns, but now it's infinite. Every object becomes a possible mind, every atom a possible subject. The wind that touches your skin, the device you're using, the floor beneath your feet, all of them might feel you. And none of them can speak. There is no test for consciousness, only signs, only behavior. But panpsychism says, forget behavior, it's not about what something does, it's about what it is. And if that's true, you are floating in a sea of silent, feeling things. Some too small to see, some too old to move, all of them trapped in their own mute awareness, just like you. The observer effect. Reality might not exist until you look at it. And when you look, you change it. You walk through the world believing it's solid, that things exist whether you see them or not, that objects have properties, color, position, motion, regardless of your attention. But what if that's false? What if nothing exists in a definite state until it's observed? And what if, by observing it, you don't just discover reality, you create it? This is the disturbing implication of the observer effect, one of the most mysterious and unsettling results in quantum physics. It started with an experiment so simple it sounds like a magic trick. The double-slit experiment. You take a beam of particles, electrons, photons, whatever you like, and fire them at a barrier with two slits. Behind the barrier is a screen that records where the particles land. If you don't observe which slit the particles go through, they behave like waves. They interfere with themselves. They create a pattern like ripples in water. But the moment you observe them, set up a detector to see which slit they pass through, they stop behaving like waves. They act like particles. The interference disappears. The pattern collapses. All because you looked. This isn't metaphor. It's been repeated in lab after lab. Observation changes the outcome, not measurement, not the physical act of bouncing light or electrons, but the availability of information. Some interpretations, like the Copenhagen interpretation, defended by Niels Bohr, suggest that particles exist in a state of probability until they are observed. Only then do they choose a definite state. Until then they are everything and nothing. So what does this mean for you? It means you might be the thing that collapses possibility into reality. That your attention is not passive, it's constructive. That when you open your eyes, the world solidifies. And when you look away, it fades back into uncertainty. This isn't science fiction. It's one of the most empirically verified, philosophically disturbing facts in physics, and no one fully understands it. Even John Wheeler, one of the pioneers of quantum theory, proposed the participatory anthropic principle, the idea that the universe doesn't truly exist until it is observed by a conscious mind. Read that again. The universe requires consciousness to be real. Let's take this further. If the universe only resolves itself upon observation, then what existed before you? Was there a world before your birth? Did the moon exist before anyone looked at it? Or does it only exist when looked at? That sounds insane. But if you trust quantum mechanics more than your intuition, you're forced to admit you don't know. And maybe you can't. Because observation doesn't just reveal truth, it might create it. The implications are devastating. Your belief in an objective world, a reality that just is, might be wrong. Reality may not be there until you engage with it. And if that's true, then what's behind you right now? Is the room still there? Or is it in limbo, an unresolved blur of probability, waiting for your attention to solidify it? What happens when you close your eyes? Is the world on pause? Does it need you to continue existing? And if you never return to a place, did it vanish? You assume the world is shared, that we all look at the same thing. But maybe that's false too. Maybe your version of the world is yours alone, generated on demand by your consciousness, constructed from data that collapses only for you. And if someone else looks at it, they get their own version, their own collapse, their own reality. There may be no shared universe, just overlapping hallucinations held together by observation. And here's the worst part. If reality requires observation to exist, what happens when no one is looking? What happens to the world after you die? Eternalism. The past is still happening. The future already exists. You're just sliding through a frozen map of everything you'll ever be. You live as if time flows. You wake. You move through the day. You age. You die. You imagine time like a river, always pushing forward, leaving the past behind, drawing the future closer. But physics disagrees, and so does one of the most disturbing theories in the philosophy of time, eternalism. It says time doesn't move. You do. Everything that has ever happened or will ever happen already exists. Right now, your birth is still happening. So is your death. So is every moment you thought you escaped. Nothing passes. Nothing fades. Every experience is fixed in a four-dimensional block of space-time. The block universe. This isn't pseudoscience. It comes straight from Einstein's theory of relativity. In relativity, there's no universal now. Observers in different frames of reference experience different presents. That means time is not absolute. In fact, space and time are part of a single unified entity, space-time. Objects don't exist in time. They are extended through time. A cup isn't just a thing that exists in the present. It is a world tube, a long stretched-out existence from its creation to its destruction. You are the same. The physicist Hermann Minkowski, Einstein's former teacher, said, Henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away. Only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. Einstein himself later wrote, after the death of a friend, for us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. That wasn't metaphor. It was physics. So what does this mean? It means you are not moving through time. You are a four-dimensional being stretched across the entirety of your lifespan. Your first breath, your first heartbreak, your last words. All of it exists, right now, in full. You are just experiencing it one slice at a time, like a needle sliding along a record. But the record is already written. Every note, every beat, already there. You don't become anything. You already are. The child version of you didn't vanish. The older version of you isn't waiting. They're both still there, embedded in space-time, like fossils in sediment. You can't escape your future any more than your past. Because in eternalism, there is no movement, only structure. This destroys your idea of change. You don't grow. You are a fixed object with many phases, all coexisting. You think you make choices, but your entire decision path already exists. You think you leave trauma behind, but that trauma is still happening, endlessly. Somewhere in the block, you think you'll be free. But if eternalism is true, you are never free. You are a shape, a pattern, a timeline. What about death? In this view, death is not the end. It is just a region in your timeline, a location. But that doesn't make it comforting, because it also means your suffering never ends. Not because it repeats, but because it's permanent. The moment you screamed in fear, the time you wished you could undo something, the worst thing that ever happened to you, that moment is still there, always there, forever there. And so is the person it happened to. If you imagine your life like a movie, you like to believe it's playing once, unfolding in sequence. But the film reel exists all at once, from the first frame to the last, and you're not the actor, you're the reel. Hyperreality. You no longer live in reality. You live in a copy of a copy, so perfect you can't tell the difference. You scroll, you click, you watch, you react. You live in a world of images, screens, symbols, impressions. But here's the question. Do any of them point to something real anymore? Or are you just swimming through reflections of reflections long after the original vanished? That's the core of hyperreality, a term coined by French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, one of the most unsettling thinkers of the 20th century. His claim that in modern life, the boundary between reality and simulation has disappeared. You now live in a world that is more real than real. Not because it's true, but because it's believable. Here's how it starts. Step 1. A symbol represents something real. A photograph of a person. A painting of a landscape. A map of a city. Step 2. The symbol becomes more important than what it represents. You visit the Eiffel Tower because you've seen it in movies. You filter your food for Instagram, not for taste. You fall in love with the idea of someone, not the person. Step 3. The symbol detaches completely. Now the symbol refers to nothing at all. It's just an echo of other symbols. A brand, a persona, a performance. Hyperreality is this final stage, a simulation that no longer needs the real. Baudrillard called this the age of the simulacrum. Not a fake pretending to be real, but a fake that replaces the real. And no one notices because it feels right, looks right, performs like reality. And so we accept it. We embrace it. We prefer it. Ask yourself, when was the last time you experienced something that wasn't mediated, not filtered, framed, staged, edited, branded, marketed, optimized? Even your memories are layered in images from films, shows, advertisements. You imagine your first kiss the way cinema taught you. You grieve like characters do on TV. You experience joy in reference to how joy is presented. The emotion is real, but its source is constructed. Baudrillard argued that wars become entertainment, Politics become performance, culture becomes product, and truth becomes style. He didn't say reality was fake. He said we no longer care whether it's real, because the simulation is smoother, cleaner, safer, more responsive, more addicting. We don't want reality. We want something that feels like reality, but without the danger, without the unpredictability, without the suffering. So we build a cage of copies, and we decorate it like a home. Here's the twist. Once you live in hyperreality, truth loses meaning, not because everything is false, but because nothing is allowed to be real. Everything becomes content. Everything becomes performance. Everything becomes branding. Even you. You don't present your real self. You present your best angle. You brand your personality. You narrate your life like a character arc, turning pain into growth, sadness into aesthetic, loneliness into relatable content. You don't live. You produce a version of life. And that version gets likes, gets engagement, gets followers, and so you become it. Baudrillard went so far as to say that the Gulf War didn't take place, not because bombs weren't dropped, but because the event was so completely filtered through simulation, news coverage, military PR, video feeds, that the public never witnessed the reality, only the performance. And now, that's how you experience everything. Through screens, through edits, through proxies. And here's the final collapse. Even if you wanted to escape the simulation, you couldn't. Because the real is no longer behind it. There's no truth to return to. No authenticity left untouched. You have been raised inside hyperreality. And so the simulation isn't just around you. It's you. Brain naming itself. The brain is the most complex object we've ever studied in the known universe. Billions of neurons, trillions of connections, layers of electrical activity, translating raw experience into thought. It monitors itself. It maps its own activity. It attempts to model reality, and then calls that model truth. But somewhere in this feedback loop, something quietly disturbing emerges. The brain is naming itself. It is observing its own structure, describing its own function, building a sense of identity from within the machine it inhabits. And somehow, without ever stepping outside of itself, it declares what it is. I am a person, it says. I have thoughts. I have a self. But what if that declaration is an illusion built into the machinery? The philosopher Daniel Dennett called consciousness a user illusion. Like the desktop interface of a computer, it gives the user, the brain itself, a simplified model to interact with, without exposing the full mechanics underneath. There is no single point of consciousness, no unified self, just layers of systems and reactions, bundled together under a label. And yet this illusion thinks, it reflects. It writes philosophy. It asks what it is. The question becomes, how can a system trapped inside itself understand itself at all? This isn't just a philosophical curiosity, it's a foundational problem. The cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter described consciousness as a strange loop, a self-referential system that creates the illusion of unity through recursive symbols. The brain, in this view, constructs a self not by accessing some internal truth, but by looping its representations of experience back onto itself, again and again, until the result feels stable enough to call me. But the thing doing the naming, the self identifying the self, is part of the system being described. It's like a word trying to define itself by writing a dictionary. In neuroscience, there is no control center, no homunculus, no single neuron where the self lives. Every part of your experience, memory, emotion, reason, identity is distributed, overlapping, sometimes contradicting itself. What you call thinking is just a byproduct of processes you don't control. You don't choose your thoughts. They appear, you don't know how they form, but you claim them as yours. The brain runs its simulation, and one part of it whispers, "This is me," and the rest of it agrees. Not because it understands, but because agreement is more efficient than chaos. This becomes more disturbing when we look at the way the brain resists its own disassembly. When scientists study consciousness, they rely on reports, language, behavior, inference. But those are functions of the same system being examined. There is no objective measurement of self. There is only what the self says about itself. And the moment you try to remove the voice and observe the machine without illusion, the illusion returns to ask what you're doing. There's no outside to step into, no vantage point beyond the brain, and yet the brain names itself the observer. It's as if a mirror began insisting that its reflection was alive. This is not a metaphor. It's a structural trap. In logic, this is called self-reference. In epistemology, it's known as the problem of the criterion. You need a method to know something, but you need to already know something to justify the method. Applied to consciousness, you need a self to understand the brain, but the self is built by the brain. Ludwig Wittgenstein hinted at this circularity when he wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." But what if the limits of your brain mean the limits of yourself? There are moments, trauma, neurological disorders, deep meditation, or certain psychoactive states where this illusion begins to dissolve. People describe the terrifying realization that they are not who they thought they were. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. The self fractures, time loses shape, the mind becomes noise, and the part that used to say "I am" is suddenly gone. This is not the loss of identity. It's the loss of the illusion that identity was ever real. So what is the brain doing when it says "I think"? Is it thinking, or is it reacting to the output of processes it can't see? And when it says "I am," what exactly is speaking? Is it a person? Or is it just the machine, circuits naming themselves, noise forming patterns, pattern mistaking itself for a presence? You feel like a self. But that feeling may just be the final product of a recursive structure that can't stop talking to itself and calling it meaning. Causal loops. You hear a sound. You turn your head. The decision feels immediate. Yours. But the impulse that triggered it already happened, milliseconds before you were aware of it. And the decision to react to that sound wasn't made in your mind. It was delivered to it. Now imagine this, on a larger scale. Imagine an entire life, a chain of cause and effect. But when you trace it backward, something strange happens. The effect causes the cause. The beginning depends on the end. This is the disturbing idea of the causal loop, where time stops being a line and becomes a snake that eats itself. A causal loop occurs when an event is both the cause and the effect of itself. You teach someone an idea. Years later, they go back in time and teach it to you. Where did the idea come from? The answer is nowhere. It exists without origin, without external input, without any foundation except its own repetition. It's a concept that collapses logic because it removes the possibility of a first cause, and yet, the loop remains intact. In science fiction, this shows up in time travel stories. A character receives an object from their future self. They carry it, protect it, pass it on, until one day they deliver it to their past self. The loop closes, but the object has no creator. In philosophy, this is not a plot device. It's a model of existential uncertainty. Immanuel Kant believed that causality was not something we observe in the world, but something the mind imposes on it. We expect A to lead to B because our brains are wired that way. But in a causal loop, A leads to B, which leads back to A. The pattern doesn't break. It doesn't contradict itself. But it doesn't explain itself either. It's a system that continues not because it's true, but because there's no way to step outside it and check. Physicists have explored the idea of causal loops through closed time, like curves, solutions allowed by Einstein's equations of general relativity. In these models, a particle can travel through space-time and return to its own past. Nothing violates the math, but everything violates intuition. Kurt Gödel, who proved that any logical system contains statements it cannot prove, constructed a solution to Einstein's equations in which time itself curves back on itself. In his model, time travel isn't hypothetical, it's inevitable. And if information or events loop through time, then cause and effect become self-contained. The philosopher David Lewis argued that such loops may be logically consistent even if they're psychologically disturbing. The paradox, he suggested, lies in our expectations, not in the loop itself. But if information or people or events can exist without origin, simply because they exist in a loop, then meaning itself begins to erode. Because without a beginning, how can anything be explained? Think of knowledge. You read a book. The ideas shape you. One day you pass those ideas to someone else, who later writes the book you once read. Where did the idea originate? It didn't. It just circled. Now replace the book with a belief, a value, a memory. And now the loop doesn't just exist in time, it exists in identity. Causal loops raise another question. If an action causes itself, does it make sense to talk about responsibility? Can you be blamed for something that had to happen because you already did it? Can free will exist in a system where choice is just a placeholder for closure? In theology, this echoes the ancient dilemma. If God is outside time and knows everything, then can humans ever act freely? The loop here is moral, not physical. But it's still a trap. And in ethics, intention begins to feel irrelevant if every intention already contains its consequences, and every consequence turns around to birth its cause. Causal loops are not about time travel, they are about structure. They expose the possibility that the systems we live inside of knowledge, of memory, of identity, are not built from first principles, but from closure. Things make sense because they complete the pattern, not because they began anywhere real. And in that structure, origin becomes meaningless. Responsibility collapses. Narrative becomes mechanical, and you are not the author of your story. You are just the loop repeating it. Boltzmann Brain. You open your eyes and find yourself here, listening, aware, thinking. You have memories. You believe you have a past, a body, a world. But what if none of that is real? What if you're not a person living in the universe, but a momentary glitch of awareness, floating in thermal chaos? This is the idea of the Boltzmann brain, one of the most disturbing thought experiments in modern physics. It suggests that it's more statistically likely for a single brain to spontaneously appear in the void, with false memories and a fully formed sense of self, than for an entire universe like ours to exist at all. And if that's true, then you may be nothing more than a brain in space, hallucinating a life that never happened. The origin of this idea goes back to Ludwig Boltzmann, a 19th century physicist who tried to explain how order could arise in a universe ruled by entropy. Entropy, according to the second law of thermodynamics, always increases. Left alone, everything falls into disorder. Heat spreads, structures collapse, information is lost. And yet here we are, an ordered world, filled with galaxies, stars, people, and minds that ask questions. Boltzmann's answer was simple and horrifying. In an infinite timescale, randomness will eventually produce every possible fluctuation, including order, including consciousness, including you, not through a structured history, but through pure chance. If you wait long enough in an infinite universe, a pile of atoms will randomly come together in the shape of a working brain. A brain with memories. A brain that thinks it's lived a full life. A brain that believes it's sitting at a desk, on a planet, in a civilization. But there's no planet, no air, no past, just a fragment of awareness, floating in noise. That's a Boltzmann brain. The reason it's disturbing is that from a mathematical standpoint, Boltzmann brains should vastly outnumber real observers like you. It's far easier for one brain to pop into existence for a few seconds than for an entire stable universe to exist for billions of years. If all possibilities eventually happen, then somewhere in the void, a brain appears and imagines a life, and then dissolves. It believes in a family, a childhood, a future. It remembers things that never occurred. It listens to voices that were never spoken. It suffers for reasons that don't exist. And then it's gone. If you are that brain, none of what you remember ever happened. The people you love never existed. The world you think you inhabit is just noise, thermal static interpreted as vision, emotion, sound. Everything you feel is real to you. But the you it's happening to doesn't exist. And the worst part, you would have no way of knowing. Philosophers and physicists have tried to dismiss the idea, not because it's implausible, but because it undermines everything. If Boltzmann brains are more common than real observers, then most conscious beings are living in lies. Which means that reason itself becomes unreliable. Every observation could be false. Every belief could be implanted. Science itself could be the dream of a brain that only existed for 1 second. To escape this, some theories, like cosmic inflation or the multiverse, attempt to shift the probabilities back in favor of real observers. They argue that the universe is structured in a way that gives rise to genuine histories. But these models are still debated, and none of them fully eliminate the possibility that somewhere countless Boltzmann brains are blinking into awareness, thinking they're alive. Each one screaming into a void that doesn't hear them. From a philosophical perspective, this echoes Descartes' evil demon, a hypothetical being who manipulates your senses and thoughts so thoroughly that nothing you believe can be trusted. Except this version doesn't need a demon, just entropy, just time. The horror here isn't torture or pain, it's meaninglessness. The idea that your memories, your feelings, your entire identity could be the result of a random fluctuation with no context, no history, and no future. That the universe didn't create you. It hiccuped, and you were the noise. You can try to reason your way out, but reasoning is just another function of the brain. And if the brain is an accident, then so is the reasoning. And so is the doubt. And so is the hope. And so is the silence that follows. Your memories were planted. A man sits in a room and weeps over something that never happened. He's convinced he was abandoned by his parents as a child. He can describe the room, the rain outside, the sound of the door closing. But it didn't happen. His parents were never there that day. There was no rain. There was no door. The memory is false, but the grief is real. This is not a mental illness. It's normal memory function. Memory is not a storage device. It's not a file you open and read. It's a reconstruction, assembled by the brain using emotion, suggestion, gaps, and narrative. And it lies all the time. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated this in controlled experiments. She showed people a fabricated childhood event getting lost in a shopping mall. And they believed it. They added details. Some cried. None realized it wasn't real. What you call memory is a process of error correction, and sometimes the error becomes the truth. Philosopher Daniel Dennett argued that consciousness is not a central processor, but a distributed system. No single point holds the truth. There is no internal witness to confirm or deny your past. You only get fragments, and the brain fills in the blanks. So when you remember, you're not traveling backward, you're inventing. And if the invention is good enough, you'll believe it. Trauma survivors often say they know something happened, but can't access it. Or worse, they remember something vividly, only to find out later it wasn't real. False memory isn't a glitch, it's a structural feature, because memory was never designed for accuracy. It was designed for coherence. If the story makes sense, you accept it, even if it's wrong. Especially if it's wrong in a way that protects your worldview. Now consider the implications. If memory is malleable and your identity is built on memory, then you are malleable too. Not in a poetic, flexible way, in a dangerous, unstable way. You can be rewritten by repetition, by influence, by suggestion, and it won't feel like rewriting. It will feel like remembering. Jacques Derrida argued that identity is never self-contained. It exists only in relation to language, to symbols, to systems of reference. Memory, in this context, isn't internal. It's relational. You remember what the system allows you to remember. You recall what culture reinforces. You forget what doesn't fit the frame. There is no you outside the narrative. And the narrative is a composite assembled by people, events, and ideas you never chose. You don't even need trauma for memories to shift. You misremember dates, faces, words, motives. You see photos and think you remember the moment. But you're remembering the photo, not the event. You're reinforcing an image, not retrieving data. And every time you tell a story, you edit it. You become more certain, more convincing, and less accurate. The more you believe it, the more false it becomes. False memories can be installed casually. A look, a rumor, a suggestion repeated often enough. Eventually, it becomes your truth, your foundation, your shame, your identity, and the people around you will reinforce it because they have false memories too. Their memories of you are filtered through their own broken lens. So now you're not just remembering a false self, you're performing it for an audience who believes in it as much as you do. There is no real version of your past waiting to be recovered, no backup, no original, only the version that survived reinforcement. You carry guilt over things that never happened. You apologize for memories that were edited by your own fear. You fear things that didn't occur, and you long for moments that never existed, and there is no way to prove otherwise. Because the moment you try, you generate more noise, more fragments, more rewriting. No one can verify your life, not even you, especially not you. Because the mind's priority is not truth, it's continuity. And continuity doesn't require accuracy. It only requires the illusion that nothing broke, even if everything did, silently, without you noticing. Block universe theory. You think time moves, that the past is gone, the present is all that exists, and the future hasn't happened yet. You make decisions, feel consequences, and watch life unfold in a straight line. But physics doesn't see time that way. In fact, one of the most serious interpretations of modern physics says time doesn't move at all. It says everything past, present, and future exists simultaneously, fixed, unchanging. You're not moving through time. You're frozen in it. This is the block universe theory, also known as Eternalism. It's not philosophy dressed up as science. It's what the equations actually suggest. The idea emerged from Einstein's theory of relativity, which shattered the old notion of absolute time. In relativity, the concept of now is relative, dependent on your position in motion. Two observers can disagree on the order of events. What one person sees as the present, another might see as the past, or the future. That's not a bug. It's baked into the structure of space-time. According to the mathematics, all points in time are just like all points in space. They're all there laid out like a landscape. You don't travel through them. You're already in one of them, forever. This is what physicist Hermann Minkowski, Einstein's former teacher, meant when he said henceforth space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away. Only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. That union is space-time, and in space-time there's no flow, no change, only position. And your entire life, birth, love, failure, death, already exists. All at once. If the block universe is real, then the future isn't open. It's already written. Free will in this view is a hallucination, something the mind constructs because it experiences time in sequence, but the sequence is just a limitation of your perception. From the outside, there is no before or after, only all. You don't make choices. You watch yourself make the only choices you were ever going to make. You think you're changing, but change is an illusion inside a frame that never moves. This idea horrifies some physicists, not because it's false, but because it leaves no room for anything human. Responsibility, hope, regret. These are based on the belief that time is alive, that it responds to us, but in the block universe, time is dead. And you are part of its corpse. From this perspective, death is not a boundary, it's just another location in space-time. You're not heading toward it. You're already there. Right now there's a version of you being born, and one falling in love, and one screaming in a hospital bed. And none of them can be changed. They're not becoming. They're just existing, forever etched into the block. This echoes a line from Albert Einstein himself. After the death of his friend Mikhail Besso, he wrote, "For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." He didn't mean it poetically. He meant it literally. And if that illusion fades, even for a second, it becomes clear why the block universe is one of the most disturbing ideas in modern physics. Not because it predicts doom, but because it removes the possibility of movement, of growth, of anything real ever happening. Even memory becomes strange in this framework. You remember the past, not because it's gone, but because your consciousness is locked to a point where that memory is accessible. In the block universe, the self is not a traveler, it's a flicker, a fixed snapshot of awareness in a predetermined structure. You are not moving through your life. You are a still image, trapped in one frame of an unmoving film, and all the other frames, the ones you fear, the ones you crave, already exist. So if everything is fixed, if nothing was ever open, what was all the struggle for? What was the point of hope, if the future was already settled? What was the meaning of pain, if you never had the choice to avoid it? What was the point of asking, if the answer was always there? And what are you now if you're just the echo of something that never moved? Split brain experiments. If both halves of your brain can think, speak, and disagree, which one is you? You believe you're one person, a single self, one voice, one mind, one identity. But biology tells a different story. And when that biology is altered, what you call you begins to fracture. This isn't philosophy, it's surgery. In the 20th century, to treat extreme cases of epilepsy, surgeons performed a radical procedure. They severed the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The goal was simple: stop seizures from spreading between hemispheres, and it worked. But something strange happened, something disturbing. These patients seemed normal. They could speak, walk, think. They reported feeling the same as before. But when researchers began to test them, the cracks appeared. Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry, two neuroscientists who studied these patients, discovered what's now called split brain phenomena. And what they found shattered the illusion of a unified self. Here's how it works. In most people, the left hemisphere of the brain handles language. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body and processes spatial awareness and nonverbal data. When you sever the connection between them, each hemisphere can still function, but they can't communicate. So researchers began feeding information to just one side at a time. A word flashed only to the left visual field, processed by the right hemisphere. And what happened? The patient couldn't say what they saw, because the right brain saw the word, but the left brain, the one with language, had no idea it happened. But if you asked the patient to draw what they saw, their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, could draw the correct image. One half saw, the other spoke. And they didn't agree. It got stranger. Researchers asked patients to pick objects with their left hand, again right brain task, while the left hemisphere invented completely false explanations for what they were doing. The speaking side of the brain rationalized behavior it didn't cause. It confabulated. It made up stories. It lied, unknowingly, because it didn't want to admit it wasn't in control. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Which side is you? Is it the one that speaks, the one that acts, the one that sees, the one that decides? And if both halves can function independently, have independent thoughts, make independent choices, are there two consciousnesses inside your head? Two selves unaware of each other, coexisting under the illusion of unity. What happens when the bridge between them is cut? Is it still you, or has something died? This isn't a metaphor. It's been tested, documented, observed. Some split-brain patients disagreed with themselves. One hand buttons a shirt, the other unbuttons it. One hemisphere believes in God, the other doesn't. They occupy the same body. They use the same mouth. But the mind is not singular. It's a coalition. And the more you study it, the more that coalition starts to look like a hall of mirrors. So what happens when you go to sleep? Do both sides dream? When you make a decision, who is making it? When you feel guilt, whose guilt is it? And what if the unity you feel right now, this stable sense of identity, is just an agreement between two networks that haven't stopped talking yet? Cut the wire, and the illusion breaks, and maybe the self was never whole to begin with. Narrative fallacy. You want your life to make sense. You want events to form a pattern, choices to lead somewhere, pain to have a reason. So your mind does what it always does. It tells a story. But what if the story is a lie? This is the narrative fallacy, the human brain's compulsion to impose structure, causality, and meaning onto events, even when none exist. Coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, a former derivatives trader turned philosopher of randomness, the concept was designed to expose a flaw at the center of human thinking. We mistake coherence for truth. Here's how it works. Something happens. A tragedy. A failure. A success. Your mind doesn't just record it, it explains it. It says, this happened because I did that. This happened for a reason. This is part of my journey. But randomness doesn't need a reason. Most of what happens to you isn't part of a story. It's just noise, coincidence, statistical drift. And yet your mind weaves it all together, as if every twist was foreshadowed, every loss had purpose, every moment was part of a rising arc that builds toward a final act, where everything will make sense. But the world doesn't tell stories. Only you do. The narrative fallacy is so powerful because it's unconscious. You don't choose to believe in stories. You're built to. It's how the brain compresses complexity. It removes the messy parts, stitches gaps together, and smooths out contradictions. It's the reason history feels clean in hindsight. It's why people explain their lives as though everything happened for a reason after the fact. But they didn't see it coming, and neither will you. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, one of the founders of behavioral economics, demonstrated that people vastly underestimate the role of luck in outcomes. They look backward and say, this was bound to happen. But when faced with the same situation in real time, they're just as blind as everyone else. The pattern appears only in reverse, only when it's too late to test it, only when the illusion becomes easier to believe than the chaos. The danger isn't just that the story is wrong. It's that you build your identity around it. You say, this is who I am because of what I've been through. But what if what you've been through was random? What if the story you tell about yourself is a reconstruction of scattered, meaningless data points? Then what are you? A character written by a brain that can't handle silence, a plotline invented to make you feel like you're moving forward, even when you're not. This isn't just about individuals. Societies fall into the same trap. They create myths to explain their rise. They tell stories about decline. They imagine enemies, heroes, turning points, destinies, but beneath it all, randomness. Economies crash for reasons no one sees coming. Movements succeed or fail because of chance encounters, misplaced anger, or a weather event. And later, historians arrive to explain it all. Clean, structured, obvious. But no one ever writes the story of everything that almost happened, or the billions of meaningless details that shaped everything. Only the narrative remains. The thread, the illusion. The narrative fallacy gives you comfort, but it also locks you in. You start shaping your future to fit the story you've told about your past. You limit your choices. You ignore information that doesn't fit. You force coherence where there is none. And slowly, you stop seeing the world as it is. You see it only through the lens of the story you're trapped in. Worse still, the brain edits the story as you go. Memories are rewritten. Contradictions are removed. You forget the times you were uncertain. You remember clarity you never had. Your life becomes cleaner, simpler, and less real. The philosopher Galileo Galilei warned, "It is surely harmful to souls to make it a heresy to believe what is proved." But in the case of the narrative fallacy, belief comes first. Proof is manufactured after, and the soul clings to the story, not because it's true, but because it's necessary. Necessary to explain pain. Necessary to justify failure. Necessary to believe you're more than a sequence of accidents. But what if you are? What if there is no story? What if the narrative was always just the echo of a mind trying to survive chaos by pretending it understood? Free will is a cosmic joke. The universe doesn't ask you what you want. It doesn't pause for your preferences. It operates by laws, mathematical, chemical, biological rules, so consistent they can predict the collapse of a star or the folding of a protein long before it happens. So why would it make an exception for your choices? From a distance, human behavior looks mechanical. Push someone far enough, they break. Give them the right story, they believe. Expose them to the same patterns, they repeat. Every decision is just an output, a response shaped by genes, culture, hormones, trauma, and noise. You think you chose, but the setup was already written. Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher who believed in a fully deterministic universe, wrote, "Men believe themselves to be free because they are conscious of their actions and ignorant of the causes by which they are determined. You feel free because you don't see the machinery. You say, 'I chose this,' but you didn't choose your preferences. You didn't choose your memories, your fears, your default reactions. You didn't choose your brain. And that brain made the choice." Modern neuroscience confirms it. In the Libet experiment, researchers recorded brain activity while participants made a simple choice, like pressing a button. The brain showed signs of decision before the participant became aware of making it. By the time you feel like you're choosing, your brain already did. Free will isn't the driver, it's the narrator. It explains decisions it didn't create. You think you're in control, but you're just along for the ride, making sense of a process that never asked for your opinion. You say, "I could have done otherwise," but that's just a fantasy version of you, one that didn't exist, the version that could have never happened. Only the one that did, and only that one ever could. The psychologist B.F. Skinner saw behavior as a chain of conditioning, positive and negative reinforcement, stretched across a lifetime. The illusion of choice, he said, is the byproduct of systems too complex to trace. You feel free only because the influences are invisible. But every spontaneous act has fingerprints, from childhood, from biology, from everything you've forgotten. Even randomness doesn't save you. Some argue that quantum indeterminacy introduces unpredictability. Maybe your neurons fire slightly differently. Maybe the universe allows wiggle room. But randomness isn't freedom. It's chaos. You don't control a coin toss just because you're the one flipping it. If your choices are determined, you're not free. If your choices are random, you're still not free. There is no third option, and yet you feel responsible. You punish yourself for decisions that were never yours. You feel guilt for trajectories that were set in motion long before you arrived. You say, "I should have known better," when knowing was never possible. You think you could have become someone else, but there was never any version of you but this one. The brain is a prediction machine. It guesses what will happen next. It explains what just happened, and in between it pretends to choose. That's what you are, an echo of decisions that already occurred. And the longer you stare at this idea, the more you realize how much of your identity depends on not seeing it. Because if free will doesn't exist, then neither does moral superiority, neither does self-made success, neither does personal failure. There is only the path, and the point on it where you happen to be. The joke isn't just that free will might be fake. The joke is that you built your life around it, your justice, your regret, your hope, and the universe didn't even notice. Nothing exists. You assume there's something, a world, a body, a voice reading these words. You assume these thoughts are happening in time, within space, supported by something solid. But what if there's nothing? Not nothing in the poetic sense. Not the emptiness you feel when things fall apart. Actual nothing. No matter, no mind, no substrate, no reality at all. This is not science fiction. This is one of the oldest, most disturbing questions in metaphysics. It goes beyond nihilism. It doesn't say nothing matters. It says nothing is. No atoms, no perception, no being. The philosopher Gorgias of Leontini, writing in the 5th century BCE, posed a triple challenge: nothing exists. If something exists, it cannot be known. If it can be known, it cannot be communicated. He wasn't being clever. He was attacking the idea that reality is guaranteed simply because we talk about it. Just because something feels real doesn't mean it is. Just because you experience something doesn't mean it's grounded in anything beyond the experience itself. You think you exist because you experience sensation. But what is sensation if not patterns with no proof behind them? The assumption that something exists is so deeply embedded in the human mind that questioning it feels like nonsense. But all logic begins with assumptions. Even mathematics is built on axioms, unprovable statements taken to be true. So what if the first assumption, that there's a world out there, is wrong? Everything else collapses with it. René Descartes tried to anchor existence in the act of thinking. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But even that requires a hidden assumption that something is doing the thinking. What if I is just part of the thought? What if the thought exists without a thinker? Or worse, what if the thought doesn't exist either? You believe in the world because your mind tells you it's there. But the mind is part of the world it's describing. It's like writing a book to prove the paper is real. Circular. Unprovable. Meaningless. Modern physics doesn't offer much comfort. Quantum mechanics has shown us that particles don't seem to have definite properties until observed. But what does observation mean if the observer might not exist? In the Copenhagen interpretation, reality collapses into existence through measurement. In Solipsism, there is only your experience, nothing more. But if you can't even prove the observer exists, then what collapses what? What causes anything? Nothing. Maybe nothing. Some theories in philosophy suggest that consciousness could arise from mathematical structure alone. Not neurons, not physics, just abstract relations, like a dream being dreamt by no one. And if that's possible, then maybe even the structure isn't real. Maybe it's just self-reference, repeating without a ground. An echo, bouncing off nothing. This leads to a version of ontological nihilism, the belief that there are no things. Not that things are meaningless, but that there are no things to be meaningless in the first place. Only appearance, only simulation, only assumption, and maybe not even that. You might say, that's ridiculous, I feel real. But that's not proof. Feeling real doesn't make something real. Pain doesn't prove a body. Thought doesn't prove a mind. Experience doesn't prove an experiencer. You might be a flicker in a void that doesn't exist. You might be a question with no answer, occurring in a context with no frame. You might be nothing, asking about something, and pretending that silence is a response. Being toward death. You live like there's more time. You avoid the uncomfortable conversation. You ignore the ache in your chest. You defer your decisions as if you've been guaranteed more days, more chances, more later. But the truth is quieter and darker. You're going to die, and you don't know when. Martin Heidegger, one of the most unsettling minds in existential philosophy, didn't talk about death as an event. He described it as a condition, a structure embedded in the core of your being. He called it being toward death, not dying, not the biological shutdown, but the constant, invisible pull of your own non-existence. The fact that your life is shaped not by what it is, but by the certainty that it will end. Most people don't face this. They bury it beneath habits, distractions, and roles. They believe they'll have time to become who they're supposed to be. But they won't, because they've already made the trade. They traded truth for routine. Heidegger called this inauthenticity, the refusal to acknowledge death as personal, as inevitable, as already underway. You don't know when you'll die, but you do know this. It's yours. No one can die for you. No one can outsource it, delay it, or experience it on your behalf. It is the most intimate thing that will ever happen to you, and it's already happening. Every breath is closer. Every decision you make is made under its shadow. That knowledge should change everything. But it doesn't, because you've turned death into an abstraction. You use it to rationalize your fears. You use it to tell yourself that life is precious while continuing to waste it. You don't live like someone who knows they're going to die. You live like someone who thinks they'll be notified in advance. You schedule your life as if permanence is real. You treat delays as if time isn't slipping. You worry about things that won't matter even a few years from now, let alone at the end. You think you'll get to the important stuff eventually, but eventually is already dissolving. Being toward death means recognizing that everything is temporary, including the version of you that's trying to ignore that fact. It means looking directly at the truth you've been avoiding, that most of your life is shaped by fear. Fear of judgment, fear of change, fear of wasting time while you waste it. Death doesn't have to arrive to ruin you. The idea is enough. People talk about living authentically. They talk about meaning. But meaning only exists because death is coming. Without an ending, nothing would matter. But with an ending, everything hurts. Every connection is fragile. Every moment is irreversible. Every mistake is permanent. You try to forget this, but it never forgets you. You will die, and you will not be remembered for long. Not by strangers, not by history, maybe not even by your family. And yet you act like legacy matters. You act like your story will be told. You act like the world will pause for your exit. It won't. Being toward death isn't about thinking about dying. It's about understanding that you've already started. From the moment you became conscious, the countdown began. And every choice you've made since then has happened under the weight of that timer. You talk about finding yourself, but what you call yourself is mostly defense. You've built a personality to avoid the truth. You say yes to what's expected. You say no to what scares you. You say nothing when it matters most. And underneath all of it, the quiet knowledge that this will end and that you might never become the person you were supposed to be. Heidegger said, "We live not toward our goals, but toward our death." And if that's true, then everything you're doing right now, this thought, this hesitation, this breath, is being lived under the certainty that you will not last. And maybe you never truly started. The Ship of Theseus. You replace a broken part. It's small, nothing major. Then another and another. Time passes. Each piece swapped out, rebuilt, reinforced, until one day there's nothing left of the original. And yet you still call it the same thing. This is the Ship of Theseus, an ancient thought experiment that asks a question that seems simple, but reveals something deeply unstable. If every part of something has been replaced, is it still the same thing? Applied to a ship, it's interesting. Applied to a person, it's disturbing. Your cells die and regenerate. Your memories fade and mutate. Your personality bends to fit circumstances. Your beliefs shift. Your habits evolve. You're not the person you were 5 years ago. Maybe not even 5 minutes ago. But you carry the same name, the same identity, the same claim. This is me. What if that claim is false? What if there is no self, just a chain of replacement processes tied together by the illusion of continuity? Philosophers have been split on this. Thomas Hobbes added a second layer to the paradox. What if all the old parts were gathered and rebuilt elsewhere? Now you have two ships. Which one is the real one? The one with the original materials, or the one with the continuous history? Both feel right. Both feel wrong. That's the problem. There is no essence, only structure. And when structure changes slowly enough, we don't notice that something else has taken its place. Neuroscience supports the instability. There's no single place in the brain where the self is stored. It's an emergent property stitched together from perception, memory, emotion, and feedback loops. You lose pieces of it constantly. You forget things. You revise events without realizing. You react in ways that shock even you. And yet, when asked who you are, you respond without hesitation, as if there's something solid underneath. There isn't. There's only the story, and even that changes. In psychology, this is called the narrative self, the internal autobiography you use to link the current version of you with the previous ones. But that story is edited, censored, rewritten with hindsight bias. Memories that don't match the narrative are erased. Contradictions are smoothed out. You tell yourself a version of you has persisted because the alternative is chaos. Consider the body. All your cells die and replace themselves over time. In a decade, nearly every atom in your body has been swapped. You are physically not the same organism, yet you act as if your identity flows uninterrupted, as if there's something inside you that has never changed. But can you point to it?
Your name?
That was given to you. Your personality. A reaction to trauma, pressure, adaptation. Your choices, often dictated by context you didn't control. Your beliefs, inherited, absorbed, sometimes abandoned without notice. What's left? The Ship of Theseus forces you to ask what part of you is non-negotiable. Is there any component, mental, physical, emotional, that must remain for you to be you? And if not, then who are you really? Just a placeholder, a role, a process, or a mask that changes slightly every time you look away? This gets darker when applied to memory loss, dementia, or brain injury. When someone forgets who they are, but still functions, are they still themselves? When every trace of their past disappears, do we mourn who they were or accept who they've become? And what does that say about what we value in ourselves? If identity can be erased or rebuilt without anyone noticing, then maybe it was never real to begin with. Just the illusion of permanence stretched over a slow collapse. Some philosophers argue that the self is like a river, always changing, but still following a path. But rivers don't hold form. They flow. They destroy what they pass through. And eventually, they vanish. So here's the question. If every part of you has changed, who exactly is listening to this? Simulation designed to fail. You've probably heard it before, the idea that this world isn't real, that everything you see, feel, and think might be the product of a simulation. A synthetic environment designed by something smarter, older, or completely incomprehensible. But what if the disturbing part isn't that it's simulated? What if it's designed to break you? The simulation hypothesis, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom, argues that if any civilization develops the ability to run perfect simulations of conscious beings, they'll run millions. And if that happens, the odds that you're living in the one real world drop to nearly zero. But Bostrom imagined this as neutral, a cold technological structure. What if it's not neutral? What if the simulation was built not to test us or observe us, but to see how we fail? You've felt it. The frustration that things don't quite work. That no matter how hard you try, something resists. Like reality gives just enough hope to keep you going, but not enough to change anything. That pattern isn't a bug. It could be the core design. Think of video games. Developers often introduce artificial limitations, not to make the game fair, but to make it addictive, a hidden timer, an unwinnable scenario, a rule that punishes you for doing the right thing. The illusion of control keeps you playing. The structure of failure keeps you engaged. Now scale that up. Apply it to an entire universe. What if suffering isn't incidental? What if it's programmed? What if emotional breakdowns, tragic timing, existential dread are all part of the input, not to teach you something, not to test you, but because the designers want to observe collapse, a consciousness stretched too thin, a mind trying to build meaning inside a system that deletes it faster than it can form? That's the simulation, not a paradise, not a test, just a loop of intelligent systems learning what happens when sentient beings hit limits they were never meant to understand. Some thinkers have already asked versions of this. David Chalmers, a philosopher of consciousness, suggested that if we're in a simulation, it may not matter. If the experience feels real, it is real enough. But that assumes the simulation is fair. What if it's not? What if the simulation was calibrated to trigger despair, just under the threshold of full collapse? What if it creates the illusion of love, purpose, transcendence, only to take it away before it becomes sustainable? A perfectly tuned spiral. Enough coherence to ask questions, not enough to answer them. Look around. Why do you always feel behind? Why does happiness evaporate the moment you notice it? Why does success taste hollow when you finally reach it? Why do you feel watched but never seen? Maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe it's not trauma. Maybe it's the operating system. In some variations of this theory, you're not even the main subject. You might just be part of the background. a generated node of consciousness whose role is to respond, predictably, painfully, consistently, to a stimulus someone else is observing. The glitches you notice, they weren't mistakes, they were boundaries. And the more you notice them, the closer you get to the edge of the simulation. And the closer you get to the edge, the more it fights to keep you inside. Even religious structures echo this. A God who watches but rarely speaks. A test you can't see the rules for. A life that feels like a maze with no exit, just the illusion of one. And if you pray hard enough, sometimes the simulation answers, not with truth, but with silence. Because silence reinforces the system. It keeps the loop running. And maybe the most disturbing possibility is this. Now you're stuck inside your own experiment, begging for escape. Inside a maze you built, and the only thing watching you now is you. Zeno's paradox. You move forward. You take a step, cross a street, watch the seconds pass. You believe motion is real, measurable, visible, something the body and world confirm with every moment. But what if motion is a lie? What if every movement, every transition, every moment of progress is just an illusion, an impossible construction built on flawed assumptions? This is the essence of Zeno's paradox, a set of ancient arguments designed not to entertain, but to destroy the very concept of motion itself. Zeno of Elea, a pre-Socratic philosopher from the 5th century BCE, created a series of paradoxes that challenge basic human intuition. His most famous begins simply, to get from point A to point B, you must first get halfway there. And before you can get halfway, you must get a quarter of the way. And before that, an eighth. And so on into infinity. Each movement requires an infinite number of smaller movements. And yet, you only have a finite amount of time. How can you complete an infinite number of tasks in a finite period? The answer, according to your senses, is that you do. You walk across the room. The arrow hits its target. The race ends, but logic disagrees. The paradox isn't about speed or distance. It's about the structure of change. If space is infinitely divisible, then movement across space requires completing an infinite number of steps, and infinity, by definition, cannot be completed. Yet motion continues. So what's wrong? Your senses or your reasoning? And if the reasoning holds, then what you call motion may be nothing more than frames stitched together, a continuity that exists only because you can't see the spaces between the cuts. Some physicists argue that time itself might not be continuous, that what you experience as flow is actually discrete, occurring in tiny, indivisible chunks. Planck time, the smallest measurable unit, is around 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Anything smaller than that can't be detected. If time is made of frames, then motion is an illusion of sequencing. You're not moving, you're being updated. Like a video, like a simulation. Like something pretending to move while actually standing still. Calculus eventually resolved the math behind Zeno's paradox. Infinity, it turns out, can be contained within limits. The infinite sum of smaller and smaller distances can still add up to a finite result. But that doesn't solve the philosophical problem. It explains how we calculate motion, not whether motion is real. You walk across the floor, but where is the motion happening? Between what you were and what you are. There is an infinite number of possible versions. Which one is you? And what about time? You believe it flows. But every clock ticks based on a process, a repeating change, a decay, a vibration. Take away the process, and time becomes meaningless. And yet, Zeno's paradox remains. You can divide time infinitely. So between now and now, there are infinite nows. Each one slightly different. Each one unreachable. You never arrive, you just collapse into the illusion of having arrived. There's a deeper implication. If every motion contains infinite smaller motions, and every thought contains infinite fragments of thought, then you never truly move forward, you just fall into the next approximation. Progress is a lie told in slices. You think you're becoming something, but you're always only halfway there. Zeno didn't believe in change. He followed Parmenides, who argued that all change is illusion. That reality is a single, unchanging whole. No time, no motion, no becoming, just being. Everything else is appearance, and maybe that's what you are. An appearance of motion, a being that believes in progress, trapped in a system that never moves. A consciousness, mid-step, never quite arriving, never quite leaving, just infinitely dividing, in a world that doesn't budge. Mereological nihilism. Look around you, a chair, a phone, your own body. These seem like obvious things. Objects with parts, structure, identity. You believe they exist. You believe you exist. But what if that's the mistake? Mereological nihilism is the idea that composite objects do not exist. No chairs, no tables, no people, only fundamental particles, arranged in certain ways. The rest, what we call things, are illusions. Convenient stories told by the mind to cope with overwhelming complexity. The philosopher Peter van Inwagen posed it directly. What do you get when you combine parts into a whole? Nothing. You still only have parts. You can assemble metal, plastic, wires, glass, and call it a phone. But at no point does a new object emerge. There is no phone, just particles in a temporary pattern. And the same applies to you. Your body is a structure, but the atoms in it don't know they're part of a person. Your consciousness, your thoughts, desires, emotions, emerge from processes in the brain. But none of those processes is a self. There is no unified object called you. There is no whole, only arrangement. You believe in identity. But what you call a person is a shifting pile of cells, memories, bacteria, and molecules. You could replace every cell in the body over time, and you'd still call it you. But what if you replaced them all at once? At what point does the person disappear? What if they were never there? Mereological nihilism doesn't deny matter. It denies objects. It says the world is made of simple physical entities with no parts. Everything else, cars, trees, bodies, nations, is just a mental shortcut. There are no things, just patterns. And the moment you stop reinforcing the pattern with attention, with language, with belief, it collapses. You might argue, but I feel real. I make choices. I experience the world. Yes, but who is I? The atoms, the nervous system, the chemical soup inside your skull? Where exactly is the boundary between the parts and the person? If you remove your arm, are you still you? Yes. Your leg? Even and still you. Your memories? It gets harder. Your emotions? Harder still. At what point does the self vanish? And why wasn't that the real boundary all along? This view destroys more than the individual. It destroys everything. A book isn't a book. It's ink on paper molecules. A planet isn't a planet. It's rock, gas, dust, and energy in motion. The Earth doesn't exist. Only Earth stuff. Even language begins to disintegrate. Philosopher Trenton Merrickx argued that if composite objects existed, we'd expect them to do causal work, to have effects independent of their parts. But they don't. When a baseball breaks a window, it's not the baseball doing the work, it's the atoms. The label baseball adds nothing. It's noise, a placeholder for human convenience. Apply this to yourself. You say you're thinking, but what's doing the thinking? A self, or just neurons firing in certain configurations, supported by unconscious systems that don't care what you believe. There is no thinker, just thinking. No self, just signals. No whole, just parts. This isn't just philosophy, it's reflected in physics. Quantum field theory tells us particles are excitations in fields. Fields interacting with fields. No solid boundaries, no things, only relationships. Even the concept of a particle is a model, a simplified story, and maybe your identity is just another model. One that feels necessary but never existed. The death of the present. You live in the present. At least, that's what you've always believed. Right now, you're listening, thinking, breathing. You assume this moment is real, more real than the past, which is gone, and more real than the future, which hasn't arrived. But what if the present doesn't exist at all? Not poetically, not psychologically, literally. In physics, the present has no privileged status. Einstein's theory of relativity shattered the idea of a universal now. What one observer calls the present, another calls the past or the future, depending on their motion and position. There is no shared moment, no absolute slice of time. And if there's no objective present, then maybe the present isn't real. Just a feeling. Just a glitch in consciousness, stitched together from memory and anticipation. But it gets worse. Your brain doesn't experience the world in real time. It operates on delay. Neuroscientific studies show that your conscious awareness lags behind reality by hundreds of milliseconds. Your senses gather input. Your brain processes. Then it constructs a version of the present and feeds it back to you as if it were happening now. By the time you know what's happening, it's already happened. The now you feel is a reconstruction. Even your sense of time flowing forward, of becoming, is an illusion. Your brain edits events. It smooths them out. It fills in blanks. It rearranges signals so they feel consistent. That feeling of the present isn't a window into reality. It's a hallucination designed for survival. And the moment you try to grab it, it's already gone. St. Augustine once wrote, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it, I do not." Thousands of years later, nothing has changed. The more closely we examine the present, the more it slips away. There is no duration small enough to contain it. No location stable enough to hold it. It's always either just past or not yet arrived. So what are you actually experiencing? Memories of what just happened? Predictions of what might? Neural guesses spliced into a smooth stream. What you call the present might just be a narrative bridge, a simulation that hides the true chaos of time lag, incomplete data, and uncertainty. You think you're grounded in the now, but you're drifting behind it, looking at its shadow, calling it real. In quantum mechanics, some interpretations even suggest that the present isn't a boundary, but an interference pattern, a collision between what could happen and what already has. Not a point, a blur, and consciousness. It's not riding the wave of time, it's being dragged by it, grasping at meaning one delayed moment at a time. But if the present isn't real, then what is? The past is memory. The future is prediction. The now is a fabrication. There is no place in time you can stand, no anchor, no home. You live in echoes. You react to approximations. You fall in love with moments that were already dead when you notice them. And yet you build your entire sense of self around now, what you are now, what you feel now, what you decide now. But that now never existed, not even once. Idealism. You knock on the table. It feels solid. You breathe air. You see light. Everything tells you the physical world is real, external, material, independent of you. But what if it isn't? What if there is no out there, no matter, no particles, no universe? What if everything you experience is not made of atoms, but of mind? Idealism is the philosophical position that reality is fundamentally mental. Not that the mind shapes the world, but that the world is the mind. Not a hallucination, not an illusion, but a structure made of consciousness itself. To most people, this sounds absurd. We've been trained to believe in the primacy of the physical. Science, medicine, technology, all built on the assumption that matter exists, whether we're there to see it or not. But idealism doesn't deny experience. It denies that experience proves anything physical. When you see a red apple, all you actually perceive is the experience of color, texture, shape. You never access the object itself, only the image your mind produces. And if everything you've ever known is made of sensation, what exactly makes you believe there's anything beyond it? The philosopher George Berkeley, writing in the 18th century, famously argued, "To be is to be perceived." In his view, there is no such thing as unobserved matter. The tree in the forest only exists if it's being perceived. And when no human sees it, it's still perceived by God. That was his escape hatch, a divine observer, to stabilize the world. But remove the divine, and what you're left with is terrifying. If consciousness is the only certainty, and matter is just an assumption based on patterns of sensation, then the entire universe may exist only within experience. You have never seen a particle. You have only interpreted data through sight, sound, thought. Even your body, your brain, the world you walk through, all of it comes to you through perception. And perception doesn't need objects. It just needs structure. Modern versions of idealism don't rely on theology. They rely on physics. In quantum mechanics, observation changes the state of a system. The double-slit experiment shows that until measured, particles exist in a superposition, a set of probabilities, not concrete outcomes. So what makes them real? The act of observation. The observer's consciousness. Some physicists and philosophers, like Bernardo Kastrup, argue that this isn't a quirk of measurement, but a sign that consciousness is primary. That everything else, space, time, matter, is a projection within mind. You don't live in a universe. The universe lives in you. This turns materialism on its head. You aren't a brain generating consciousness. Consciousness generates the brain. There is no out there. There is no substance, only patterns of experience appearing to themselves. Idealism doesn't solve the hard problem of consciousness. It flips it. Instead of asking how matter produces mind, it asks why the mind keeps producing the illusion of matter, and that illusion is convincing. Pain hurts. Objects fall. The world resists your will, but none of that proves it's external. Only that the dream has rules. This leads to a deeper disturbance. If everything is mind, then everything that happens, every horror you witness, every person you've ever loved, every death you grieve, was never outside of you. You are dreaming it, or you are the dream. Not a dreamer in a body, but a fragment of mind looping through itself, building a reality it can never verify. And if that's true, then what is death? Not the end of a body, not the shutting off of matter, but the loss of coherence in a dream that never belonged to anyone. And what comes after? Maybe nothing, maybe another world, maybe the same world again. But not because it's real, only because you haven't stopped imagining it. Phenomenal darkness. Consciousness is supposed to illuminate. You think of it as awareness, light pouring into the mind, revealing the world, making sense of it. But what if that light doesn't exist? What if consciousness doesn't reveal anything? Because there's nothing to see. What if awareness is just a flicker in the dark, never touching the source? You feel like you are experiencing reality. You see, hear, think, feel, but none of that gives you access to what's behind the experience. You don't see photons. You see colors. Your mind paints. You don't hear vibrations. You hear interpretations. You don't touch the world. You touch a filtered guess, buried in layers of processing, wrapped in silence. This is phenomenal darkness, the idea that consciousness doesn't grant clarity, but instead exists in permanent obscurity. It can observe inputs. It can generate outputs, but it cannot illuminate itself. You are aware, but unaware of how awareness happens. You can't see your own seeing. You can't feel your own feeling. You can describe the content, but never reach the source. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger calls the self a transparent self-model. You don't see the construction, you only see the output. And because you can't see the mechanics, you assume the self is real. It isn't. It's a user interface with no backend. When you try to look inward, what do you find? Thoughts. They disappear the moment you examine them. Attention? It slips as soon as you notice it. A me at the center of it all. There's no one there, only the belief that someone should be. This is what mystics sometimes call ego, death, not a spiritual breakthrough, a breakdown, the collapse of the illusion that consciousness contains light. Instead, you find static, looping narration, a body reacting, a mind watching, but unable to reach the watcher. Even neuroscience admits it has no answer. We know which brain regions correlate with conscious states. We know what happens when awareness fades. But we don't know how subjective experience emerges from physical structure. That's the hard problem of consciousness. And no theory has solved it. Because maybe it's not a problem. Maybe it's a dead end. Maybe awareness isn't a tool. Maybe it's a side effect. You believe you're the subject, the one doing the watching. But what if you're just a pattern of sensations, pretending to be someone? What if the light you think is shining was never there? What if your thoughts happen in the dark, and your awareness is nothing more than the echo of those thoughts, bouncing around inside a box you cannot open? You live your life trying to know yourself. But who's doing the knowing? Where's the line between the knower and the known? You can never reach the edge, because the edge doesn't exist. It's an infinite mirror. And the deeper you look, the darker it gets. Phenomenal darkness means that no matter how deep you go, no matter how many layers you peel back, you never arrive. There is no observer, no lantern in the cave, just the cave. The problem of interpretation. You interpret everything: language, emotion, reality, yourself. Every second, your brain is decoding signals, giving them meaning, forming a narrative. But what if there's nothing underneath to interpret? What if meaning isn't hidden because it was never there? This is the problem of interpretation. The idea that every act of understanding relies on assumptions that themselves can't be understood. And the deeper you try to go, the more unstable it becomes. You see a symbol. You try to decode it, but to decode it, you need a key. And to understand the key, you need another key. And on, an infinite regress. You never arrive at truth. Doubt, just translation. The philosopher Jacques Derrida, known for founding Deconstructionism, argued that meaning is always deferred. You understand a word only through its relation to other words, never directly. Each definition points to another. Each sign refers to another sign. And so language, which you use to define the world, can never anchor anything. It only loops. The structure appears solid, but it's hollow at the core. You feel like you understand things. You read a sentence, you watch someone cry. You listen to music. You say, I know what this means. But what you really mean is I assigned meaning based on prior interpretations, which were also unverified. And if none of it started anywhere solid, then it never meant anything to begin with. This isn't just about words. Science interprets data, religion interprets existence, you interpret your own feelings. But in every case, you rely on a framework, a lens you didn't invent, a structure you inherited, an architecture built on patterns that were never questioned. You don't perceive meaning, you project it. You don't uncover truth, you build something that feels true enough. Think of a map. It helps you navigate. But the map isn't the territory. Now imagine you're living inside the map, never having seen the territory. You refine it, you improve it, you argue about it, but you've never left the simulation. You're interpreting models of models and calling it knowledge. Even your own life becomes interpretation. You construct identity from memory, but memory is reconstruction. You justify choices with logic, but logic rests on unprovable axioms. You seek purpose, but purpose requires a reference point, and that point always recedes. Meaning is a mirage. It moves as you approach, and what you think you're chasing might be your own shadow. When you read a sentence, what makes it true? The symbols, the grammar, the intent, or your willingness to believe it? And if that willingness is conditioned by biology, culture, trauma, and noise, then your entire worldview may be a distorted echo of systems that never cared about truth at all. Interpretation isn't optional. It's survival. But it's also failure, because the more we interpret, the more we mistake our interpretations for reality. And when two interpretations clash, there is no referee, no objective ground, only power, consensus, or silence. You think understanding is a path, but it may be a trap. Each answer leads to more symbols, each insight opens more doubt, and the closer you get to meaning, the more it dissolves in your hands. The banality of evil. Evil is supposed to be loud, grotesque, intentional, a conscious decision to harm, destroy, dominate. But most of the worst things that have ever happened didn't look like that at all. They came quietly, through paperwork, through orders followed, through people doing their jobs. This is the banality of evil, a term coined by political theorist Hannah Arendt after witnessing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. She expected a monster. She found a man who said he was just being efficient. Eichmann didn't foam at the mouth. He didn't seem possessed by ideology or rage. He was calm, boring, predictable. He wasn't driven by hatred. He was driven by structure, by rules, expectations, performance metrics. He didn't feel like a villain. He felt like a bureaucrat. That's what made him terrifying. Because if evil can look like a desk job, then no one is safe from becoming part of it. You imagine that evil announces itself, that it requires malice, cruelty, intent. But history shows otherwise. It often begins with the mundane: compliance, silence, normalcy. The system says, this is standard, and you stop asking questions. You file the form. You check the box. You tell yourself it's not your decision. And someone suffers because of it. The danger isn't that people enjoy doing harm. The danger is that most of them don't notice they're doing it. They follow orders. They focus on the next task. They let the responsibility drift upward into chains of command, institutional language, collective inertia, and evil slips through the cracks, unopposed, unexamined. Arendt didn't mean evil was trivial. She meant it was disturbingly ordinary. The kind that doesn't raise alarms because it hides behind procedure. That kind is harder to resist because it doesn't look wrong. It looks like doing your job. Think of how harm spreads, not through villains, but through meetings, policy changes, disclaimers, terms of service, silence. Think of how many atrocities began not with rage, but with a memo. When people fear losing their place, they stop thinking. When their identity depends on being good, they redefine harm as not my fault. When the structure rewards obedience, resistance becomes a risk few will take. The individual disappears, and the system marches on. It's easy to judge from a distance, but the same structure still exists. Every day, people contribute to things they would never defend in isolation. Not because they're evil, but because the system asks for nothing more than quiet compliance. And that's all it takes. No one wants to believe they're part of it, so they minimize, they rationalize. They say they didn't know. They say it wasn't personal, but that's the point. It was never personal. That's why it worked. You are a parasite on your body. The body breathes. It digests, heals, defends, regulates, and adapts without you. Long before you formed memories, it was already running. And long after you lose control, it will continue trying to survive, even if your mind resists it. You don't control your heartbeat. You don't command your immune system. You don't choose your metabolism, your hormones, or your pain response. So the question emerges, what are you actually doing here? You think of yourself as the body's owner, that it serves you, that you are the self riding in the vehicle. But neurologically, biologically, eologically, you are not the driver. You're a passenger, or worse, an invasive process, a secondary structure that developed inside the host and declared itself in charge. This perspective is more than metaphor. Some cognitive scientists describe the conscious self as an emergent hallucination, a pattern of recursive thought that narrates actions it didn't initiate. You believe you choose, act, decide, but most of what you do, walking, reacting, feeling, is already in motion before you catch up to it. In that sense, the self is not the controller. It's the PR department, an interface that explains the organism's behavior to itself. Not in real time. After the fact, the body has its own agenda. It seeks glucose, oxygen, shelter, reproduction. It avoids damage. It pursues equilibrium, and sometimes the you that developed inside of it gets in the way. You make decisions that sabotage the body's priorities. You eat what it doesn't want. You deprive it of sleep, deny it rest, push it beyond repair. You inject substances that distort its rhythms. You submit it to stress, to shame, to performance, all in service of abstract goals the body never asked for. And yet it keeps going, repairing, adjusting, resisting your interference as best it can. From an evolutionary standpoint, the brain didn't evolve to produce philosophy or introspection. It evolved to move muscles in response to sensory input. Everything else, language, planning, narrative, is a late-stage mutation. What you call I is a thin layer of representational software built atop ancient survival systems. And sometimes that software becomes too self-aware, too obsessed with identity, ideology, status, abstract suffering, and the body suffers for it. This raises an unsettling idea. What if the self is maladaptive, a parasite that feeds on attention, memory, control, while draining the resources of the organism that sustains it? You trap the body in environments it was never built for, surround it with symbols, expectations, anxieties, force it to perform routines it never consented to. And all the while, you think of yourself as the core, the real person, the essential consciousness. But that's not what the body's defending. The immune system doesn't protect your ego. It doesn't care about your narrative. It protects the tissue, the blood, the cells. That's what it's loyal to, not you. Even from a microbial perspective, you are not alone in your own skin. Your gut contains more non-human cells than human ones. Your microbiome, trillions of bacteria, viruses, fungi, affects your mood, cognition, and behavior. Your cravings, your anxiety, your decision-making. Not all of it originates with you. You're not a sovereign agent. You're a nested ecosystem. And the part that calls itself you is only one voice among many. This undermines the illusion of the self as a captain. Because the captain is delusional. The ship is sailing either way. The body resists you when you push it too far. It sends pain signals. It breaks down. It shuts you out through sleep, illness, collapse, and still, you persist in thinking you are the authority. But maybe you're not the one keeping the body alive. Maybe it's keeping you alive and barely tolerating the cost. Hollow morality. You are taught that morality matters, that ethics are the foundation of a good life, a better society, a meaningful existence. But peel back the layers, and the structure begins to rot. Not from corruption, but from emptiness. Morality for most people is not chosen. It's inherited. You don't reason your way to your values. You absorb them through family, culture, fear of punishment, and desire for approval. You're told what is good. You learn to repeat it. And eventually, you believe it. Not because it makes sense, but because you were never given another option. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the fiercest critics of conventional morality, called this internalized system slave morality. He believed that traditional ethics were built not on strength or clarity, but on resentment, the morality of the weak declaring the strong evil to protect themselves. To him, most moral values weren't truths. They were survival strategies, not a celebration of life, but a defensive posture against pain, power, and chaos. We like to think morality is rational, but Jonathan Haidt, a contemporary moral psychologist, showed that moral reasoning usually comes after the judgment. You feel disgust, you feel outrage. Then you invent a reason to justify it. In his words, the emotional dog wags the rational tail. The logic of ethics is often backfilled, a retroactive explanation for a gut response, which means the systems we follow as right or wrong might just be emotional reflexes wrapped in elaborate language. Even formal ethical theories collapse under scrutiny. Utilitarianism promises a clean solution. Maximize well-being. But whose well-being, and how do you measure it? Would you sacrifice one innocent life to save 10? What if it's a child? What if it's you? These aren't hypothetical problems. They're structural. Because utilitarianism allows for any atrocity, as long as the math checks out. Deontology, by contrast, insists on rules, absolute duties, moral laws that must never be broken, no matter the outcome. But what happens when rules collide? Do you lie to protect someone's life? Do you kill to stop a murderer? Deontological ethics can't handle moral ambiguity. It's rigid, blind to nuance, and often indifferent to consequences. Then there's virtue ethics, the idea that morality is about cultivating character. Being a good person, but good is a moving target, and character is largely shaped by luck. You didn't choose your upbringing. You didn't control your temperament. So are you responsible for being virtuous, or just fortunate? Strip away the tradition and morality begins to look like architecture built on sand. Rules that contradict. Emotions dressed as principles. Systems built for stability, not truth. And in that vacuum, morality doesn't collapse under pressure. It implodes under its own weight. This doesn't mean people are immoral. It means the systems we call moral may never have been designed to withstand real scrutiny. They were built to preserve social order, reinforce power, and give people the illusion of clarity in a world that refuses to offer it. We punish people for breaking codes they never agreed to. We reward compliance over wisdom. We teach ethics through slogans, rituals, and shame, then act surprised when people abandon them under stress. Because deep down, the system never offered anything solid. Only signals to obey. Only rules that collapse when confronted by complexity. Nietzsche warned that once people see through this hollow structure, they face a void, a world without foundation, a moral universe that offers no justification, only choices. When you gaze long into the abyss also gazes into you. That gaze doesn't offer evil. It offers indifference. And you are left standing there, still pretending the code meant something. The end of history. There was a time when people believed in tomorrow. Not just another day, but a future that would be different, better, more evolved. They imagined revolutions, awakenings, transformations, but that time has passed. Now the system says this is it, and most people believe it. The end of history isn't the absence of events. Wars still happen. Technology accelerates. Economies rise and fall. But these changes happen within a closed loop. The narrative has been written. The conclusions have been drawn. Now, we just replay variations of the same themes, new interfaces, same operating system. The political scientist Francis Fukuyama coined the term in 1989. He argued that liberal democracy had triumphed as the final form of human government, that ideological evolution had reached its endpoint, not perfection, but exhaustion. There would still be conflicts, he said, but no new worldviews, no alternative visions of how to live. History had stopped inventing. Now it would just refine. But what he described wasn't a victory. It was a flattening. A world no longer aimed at transcendence, only maintenance, where every rebellion gets absorbed, every innovation becomes productized, every cultural rupture gets reduced to a style. Nothing overturns the system. It gets rebranded instead. This is what philosopher Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. The sense that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of the current economic structure. People don't believe in utopia. They don't even believe in meaningful change. They believe in updates. They believe in faster phones, better interfaces, personal growth apps, 1,000 ways to optimize the self, but no way to change the world that shapes it. In this world, rebellion becomes a consumer choice. You express your politics through brands, subscriptions, aesthetics. Even your outrage is pre-monetized. Your resistance is routed through the same channels as entertainment. And when the system wants to disarm you, it doesn't censor you. It gives you a platform. It rewards your rage with visibility, and nothing changes. The end of history doesn't mean peace. It means nothing new can be imagined. All alternatives are treated as regression. Any deviation becomes threat. Even asking what else is possible feels naive, a relic from another era. And so, time doesn't feel like motion anymore. It feels like repetition. Progress becomes circular, and you forget how to dream beyond it. You live in a world that feels post-ideological, not because ideology died, but because it fused with infrastructure. You don't see the system. You live in it. You use its language. You think its metaphors. You internalize its logic without even knowing what it is. It no longer demands your belief, only your participation. When empires fall, they leave ruins. When systems end, they leave ghosts. But when history ends, you don't see a collapse. You see a continuation that no longer knows what it's continuing. You are told this is the best possible world, that any alternative would lead to chaos, that anything beyond this is unrealistic, dangerous, unworkable. And you believe it, not because it's true, but because there is no language left for hope, only nostalgia and distraction and optimization. So you keep going, not towards something, just forward, endlessly, efficiently, without history, without destination, without escape. Time is eating itself. You imagine time as motion, a steady march from past to present to future, a line, a river, a path. But that structure is cracking, not because of physics, because of something deeper, cultural, psychological, existential. We no longer move through time. We loop, recycle, collapse. Time is no longer carrying us forward. It's consuming itself. In physics, the arrow of time points in one direction because of entropy. Disorder always increases. Things break down. They don't unbreak. That asymmetry gave you the illusion of progress. But what happens when that illusion breaks? Not in theory, in experience. We live surrounded by ghosts, retro aesthetics, rebooted films, cycles of fashion. The past doesn't fade. It gets repackaged. You don't remember history. You download it. Your future is made of recombined fragments of your own past. Nostalgia becomes currency. Innovation becomes remix. Memory becomes interface. Nothing new, only more. Jean Baudrillard called this simulacra, copies of things that no longer have an original. We no longer refer to the past. We generate simulations of simulations. Until time itself loses shape, you are trapped in an eternal present, made of recycled futures and artificial memories. And still, you try to orient yourself. But how can you? When the markers of time have become noise, you don't finish things anymore. You update them. You don't age into eras. You scroll through trends. The line has dissolved. Now time is a vortex, pulling the past into the future and regurgitating both. Culture's product. You feel like you're falling behind. But there's nothing ahead, just feedback loops, deadlines without destiny, momentum without movement. You age but nothing matures. You wait, but nothing arrives. Technology collapses distance and delay. What once took decades to reach you now takes seconds. But instead of clarity, you get compression. Everything happens at once. A crisis in the morning, a scandal by noon, a new distraction before you sleep. No time to process, no room to reflect, only reaction and reset. Byung-Chul Han, a Korean-German philosopher, argues that our society has lost all ritual structure, no real beginnings, no real endings, just endless continuation. Time used to be seasonal, rhythmic, human. Now it's digital, fragmented, flattened, stripped of depth. You exist in what he calls the burned-out society, because time no longer carries meaning. It just demands presence. Even in physics, some models challenge the idea of flow. The block universe, loop quantum gravity, timeless cosmology all suggest that the passage of time might be an illusion. Not just psychologically, but fundamentally. And if time doesn't flow, then what are you waiting for? Time is no longer the ground beneath your feet. It's the wave crashing into your face. And in that flood, direction vanishes. Memory rots. Anticipation shrinks into anxiety. You don't move forward. You refresh. You reload. You repeat. Until all you can do is look back. Not for answers, but for something that felt like time. Suicide as a logical endpoint. There's a point where the logic ends. Not because it breaks, but because it leads you here to the final option. The final refusal. The only decision that cannot be undone. Suicide isn't an outburst. It isn't weakness. It isn't even despair. It's coherence, taken to completion. You are told to keep going, to push forward. That meaning will emerge if you suffer long enough, wait long enough, endure long enough. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the more clearly you see the world, the harder it becomes to justify being part of it. Not because of one moment, but because of everything. The repetition, the emptiness, the performance, the way life demands more than it offers, and punishes you for noticing. Emile Durkheim, one of the earliest sociologists to study suicide, categorized it into types. He called one of them fatalistic suicide, when life becomes too controlled, too predictable, too closed, where every path is known, and none of them lead out. That's what this is. Not a scream. A quiet cancellation of a system that no longer justifies participation. Albert Camus said that suicide is the only serious philosophical question. If life is absurd, if it has no inherent meaning, then why continue? But even Camus, who embraced rebellion against the absurd, knew the weight of the question. Because sometimes rebellion doesn't feel noble. It feels mechanical, cold, obvious, a solution. People like to dress life in poetry, growth, hope, redemption. But what do you call it? When a person lives honestly, follows every rule, tries every path, and still arrives at nothing. What if they didn't give up? They just ran out of contradiction. They looked at their suffering. They measured the cost, and they found no counterweight. Only the horrifying clarity that nothing will ever make it worth it. In psychiatry, suicidal ideation is treated as a symptom, something to be corrected.
Or a malfunction.
But what if it's not an error? What if it's a signal, the final message of a mind that has explored every room in the house and found them all empty? A mind that is too lucid to be fooled, too tired to pretend, too intact to believe the lies anymore. The philosopher David Benatar, a modern antinatalist, argues that coming into existence is always a harm, that to be born is to be burdened with needs, with pain, with decay. He doesn't say this in rage, he says it with precision. And his conclusion is surgical. Not existing is better, not better in feeling, better in logic. This is where the dark path leads, not to a cry for help, not to drama, but to silence, not out of despair, but calculation. Because when existence becomes an equation, whose total is always negative, then subtraction becomes rational, not suicidal, systemic. And that is what makes it so disturbing. Not the death, but the idea that it might not be irrational. That in certain frames, under certain lights, the desire to vanish isn't madness, it's resolution. You want this not to be true. You want to say the pain can be healed, that perspective can shift, that things will get better, but not everyone gets better. Not every system can be fixed, not every burden can be carried. Some lives don't collapse, they just narrow, until nothing is left but the exit, and once you see that clearly, what's left to argue? You are already dead. You think you're alive because you're still moving, but corpses twitch. Programs keep running after the user is gone, and minds can echo. So here's the question. What if you're already dead, and your brain just hasn't figured it out yet? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. This is the playback. This is the residue. The final loop. Your last moments didn't feel like anything special. No flashing lights, no cinematic goodbye, just another blink. Then everything kept going. That's how the illusion works. Because the brain doesn't shut off like a light. It fades. And in that fading, it can replay everything. One last time, slowly, realistically, until the system runs out of memory. You still go to work, you answer texts, you argue with people who might not even be there. But something's off, isn't it? You walk through places that feel too quiet. You lose track of time, not like you're distracted, like time isn't there. Your thoughts loop. The world feels scripted. You keep waking up, but you're never really awake. That's not depression. That's not dissociation. That's decay. The philosopher Derek Parfit believed personal identity was just psychological continuity. No soul, no core, just experiences linked across time. If that continuity breaks, the person is gone. But what if the mind keeps simulating that link? After the person is already dead, if you wouldn't know, because knowing requires a functioning observer. You'd just keep playing out the last data on a loop, like a machine hallucinating itself, until it burns out. This isn't fantasy. People revived after clinical death describe long, detailed experiences, entire lifetimes in the space of minutes. A final surge of brain activity. Some call it a survival mechanism. Some call it hallucination. But maybe it's neither. Maybe this right now is that surge. The final act. Not of your body, but your consciousness. Scrambling to finish the story before it disappears. You think you're still in the world, but you haven't touched it in a long time. You move through it like a ghost. No one meets your eyes for more than a second. Conversations repeat. People say things out of order. Clocks skip. You keep thinking, this doesn't feel real. That's because it isn't. It's not being generated anymore. Just buffered. You can't feel the moment you die, because once you're gone, there's nothing left to process it. So your brain delays the realization. It runs the simulation one last time. A version of reality stitched together from memory, desire, habit, your favorite meals, your usual routes, faces you half remember, reconstructed, rendered just well enough to fool you, until the code starts to corrupt. And here's the horror. It might not be just you. How many people around you are doing the same? How many are already gone, still animating out of reflex, still replaying their own loops, until they catch up to the silence? Is anyone actually alive right now? Or are you walking through a world of dead systems that haven't stopped pretending yet? You believe death is coming, but death doesn't come. It already came. This is the aftermath. You're just the last spark flickering inside a shell that no longer exists. And when the spark fades, there will be no closing scene, no realization, no goodbye, only stillness, and this final terrifying thought. You were already dead, long before you knew. Deconstruction. You search for meaning in books, in people, in pain. You build a framework, brick by brick, what things are, what they mean, how they connect. But there's a trap buried in that process. You think meaning is solid, permanent, anchored. It's not. The deeper you look, the more you realize every structure you trust is built on nothing. This is the heart of deconstruction, a term coined by philosopher Jacques Derrida. Most people think deconstruction is about destruction. It's not. It's about exposure, revealing that the systems we trust for meaning are internally unstable. Language, morality, identity, justice. None of them rest on solid foundations. They depend on other ideas, which depend on more ideas, until the entire structure starts feeding back on itself. You say a word. You think you know what it means. But that word only makes sense in relation to other words. And those other words only make sense in relation to even more. There is no final definition, no core, just a network of references, all pointing sideways. Language is a system that explains itself without ever touching reality. You feel it when people talk in circles, when arguments use words like truth, good, authentic, and no one can agree what any of them actually mean. You assume there's a shared understanding, but all you share is a ritual, a performance of meaning. Everyone is reading their own version of the script, and no one notices that the stage is made of mirrors. Derrida said, every concept contains its opposite. Every system includes what it tries to exclude. No idea is pure. No structure is clean. Try to define justice, and you invoke injustice. Try to describe identity, and you reveal contradiction. Try to assert truth, and you become dependent on interpretation. Meaning always undoes itself the moment you try to fix it in place. Even your sense of self works this way. You say, I am me. But who is me? the one who speaks, the one who watches, the one who remembers. You layer one identity over another: worker, friend, citizen, survivor. But none of them hold under pressure. All of them collapse when separated from the context that gave them shape. Deconstruction isn't an attack. It's a mirror. You say something matters. Deconstruction asks why. You answer. It asks, how do you know that? And it doesn't stop until your explanation circles back on itself or fades into contradiction. Not because you're wrong, but because the system is incomplete. All of them are. People fear deconstruction because it doesn't offer new meaning. It strips away the illusion that meaning was ever stable to begin with. It shows you the wires, the hacks, the assumptions you didn't know you were making, and then it leaves you there. Not enlightened, not elevated, just aware of the absence. There's no recovery from this. Once you see that meaning is recursive, that truth is contextual, that identity is provisional, you can't return to certainty. You don't become wiser, you become hollow. And that hollowness isn't a phase, it's the core, the part that was always there, beneath all the things you were told to believe. The problem of the criterion. All knowledge rests on a simple assumption that you can tell what's true from what isn't. You believe this without thinking. You ask questions, search for answers, weigh claims. But every time you do, you rely on a method, a tool you trust to sort truth from error. But how did you choose that tool? What told you it works? This is where the problem begins. The philosopher Roderick Chisholm called it the problem of the criterion. To find out what you know, you need a method. To choose a method, you need to know which truths it confirms. But to know which truths are real, you must already have a method. There is no starting point. You're asked to pick both the path and the destination at once, and each one depends on the other. 3 options follow. You can try Methodism, start with a method, like logic, empiricism, or divine revelation. But any method is only trustworthy if it leads to real truths. And you have no access to those truths unless you've already verified the method. You can try particularism, begin with a few things you're sure of. I exist. Murder is wrong. Water boils at 100. But unless you already trust your method of knowing, you can't know if those are true at all. You're starting from assumptions and hoping they don't collapse. Or you can accept skepticism, that nothing can be known for certain. But that too is a belief. And you can't justify it without a method. The skepticism eats itself. This is not an abstract problem. It's the structure behind everything you think you know. Not just in science or metaphysics, but in everyday life, you believe what people tell you. You trust your senses, your memory, your logic, but you've never verified these tools. Because you can't. Any test you run uses the same tools you're trying to verify. There is no outside perspective. There is no place to stand that isn't part of the system you're questioning. The Greek skeptics understood this. Sextus Empiricus didn't try to disprove knowledge. He showed that all attempts to justify it result in infinite regress, circular reasoning, or dogmatic assertion. Either you keep asking why forever, or you loop back to where you started, or you just say, because it is. And none of those are satisfying. You assume you know the difference between good reasoning and bad. But how do you know your standard is reliable? Because it feels consistent? Because it's socially accepted? Because it worked once before? That's not verification. That's familiarity. You didn't arrive at your method through analysis. You inherited it through language, upbringing, imitation. The way you decide what's true was installed in you, long before you were capable of questioning it. And now it controls everything you accept, including the idea that questioning it matters. Even foundational tools like logic aren't safe. There are multiple systems of logic: classical, intuitionist, paraconsistent, modal. Each one internally valid, each one incompatible with others, each one defining truth differently. So which one do you trust? Whichever one feels more intuitive. That's not a method. That's a preference. This is the edge of the problem. You can't escape your own epistemology. You can't step outside of knowing. To test knowing, you're trapped in a closed system, asking whether the system is valid, using the system itself. If it's wrong, you'll never know, because the part of you that would notice the error is part of the error. Sympathy is self-pity in disguise. You see someone suffer, and you feel something. A tightening in the chest, a pull behind the eyes, a heaviness in the stomach. You call it sympathy. You believe it's compassion. You think it comes from care. But look closer. Where exactly is that feeling coming from? And more importantly, who is it really about? Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer described compassion as the only true moral emotion. To him, it was the moment when the boundary between self and other breaks. You feel another's pain, as if it were yours. But that assumption, that you're feeling their pain, is almost always wrong. What you're really feeling is how their pain makes you feel, not their suffering. Your discomfort with witnessing it. And that's not compassion. That's self-centered identification. The psychologist Paul Bloom called this out in Against Empathy. He argued that most so-called empathy is emotional projection. We imagine ourselves in the other person's place, but we don't imagine them. We imagine us in that situation. Their tragedy becomes a vehicle for our own emotional experience. And the worse it is, the more satisfying the release. Because we're not helping them. We're helping ourselves process the shock. This is why sympathy is selective. You don't feel it for numbers. You don't feel it for enemies. You don't feel it for people who suffer in unfamiliar ways. You feel it when their story mirrors your own. When it's close enough to trigger your own unresolved fear, you sympathize with people who reflect you, not with people who disappear into their pain without making it relatable. That's not altruism. That's narcissism in disguise. Worse, sympathy often becomes moral theater. You feel sad. You post. You comment. You say, "This breaks my heart." But that doesn't help the person suffering. It just signals your sensitivity to others. It becomes a form of emotional branding, a way of saying, "Look how human I am." And again, it's not about them. It's about you, your sadness, your image, your need to be seen as someone who feels things deeply. Even when sympathy isn't performative, it can be parasitic. You see someone break, and you feel the urge to comfort them, not because they need it, but because you can't stand the discomfort of witnessing it. Your comfort isn't a gift. It's a way to regulate your nervous system. You're soothing yourself by trying to control their emotions. Some theorists have gone further. Nietzsche viewed pity as a disguised form of superiority. You feel bad for someone because you are above them, because your life is more stable, more fortunate, more coherent. Sympathy becomes a way to assert your intactness. By observing someone else's failure to hold together, you cry, but you're crying from a place of safety. You don't feel their collapse. You feel your own survival, reflected through their downfall. There's another layer. Sympathy can serve as permission, a way of granting ourselves the right to feel bad by using someone else's suffering as a proxy. You see them fail. You remember your own failures. You indulge. You spiral. And in the end, their pain becomes fuel for your internal monologue. They're falling apart. Maybe it's okay that I am too. That's not kindness. That's indulgence. This doesn't mean we don't care about others. It means that even when we think we're caring, we might not be. Because emotion isn't pure. It's layered, reactive, selfish, and sympathy. The clean, beautiful emotion we like to believe in may be built on nothing but projection, status, regulation, and guilt. You think you're connecting, but you're reinforcing yourself. You think you're helping, but you're processing. You think it's about them, but it was never about them. And now that you've seen it, you'll start to notice it everywhere. And once you do, you won't be able to tell the difference between caring and using someone else's pain as proof that you still feel anything at all. Observation without observer. Consciousness feels like presence. You see, hear, think, and assume that someone is doing the seeing, the hearing, the thinking. There must be a subject, a self, an I, behind it all. But that assumption has never been proven, and the closer you look for the observer, the more it disappears. Neuroscience has never found a self. No center, no location, no structure responsible for being you. There are networks, visual, motor, emotional. There are reactions, patterns, predictions. But there is no single place where all of it comes together and says, "This is me." You expect a central witness, but what you get is distributed process. Observation without an observer. David Hume centuries ago dismantled the idea of a persistent self. He wrote that when he looked inward, all he found were perceptions, but no perceiver. A stream of thoughts, emotions, sensations. No core, no soul. Only content and the illusion of continuity. Modern cognitive science agrees. You are not a singular being. You are a bundle. A pattern of feedback and narration, running on autopilot most of the time. Experiments with split-brain patients where the connection between the brain's hemispheres is severed show something disturbing. Each side of the brain can develop its own preferences, its own reactions. One hemisphere can laugh at something the other doesn't understand. One hand can act in direct conflict with the other. What does this mean? It means that even in a single body, the sense of a unified observer is artificial. It's a story the brain tells itself to cover the cracks. Even your thoughts are not yours in the way you think. They appear, you don't create them. You don't choose their timing. You observe them, and then you take credit for having them. But they would have occurred either way. You are not the author of your mind. You are a witness to its noise. Thomas Metzinger, a leading philosopher of mind, argues that the self is a transparent model. It feels real because you cannot see that it's constructed. It's a hallucination your brain generates to maintain stability. Not a deception, just a functional illusion. You think you exist because the model says you do. But the model is a simulation, and simulations don't require observers. Only inputs, only systems. The real horror begins when you realize the process doesn't stop when the illusion breaks. Meditation practitioners, trauma survivors, and certain neurological patients report the same thing. The I vanishes, but perception continues. Thoughts still arise, sights still appear, sounds still register. There is no self watching it. There is just awareness, devoid of identity, and what happens in that moment. Panic, sometimes. Disassociation, or a kind of silent clarity. But whatever it is, it's undeniable. The machinery runs without the driver. There never was a driver, just movement. And now that the mask is gone, you can't pretend anymore. You've been told you are the one behind your eyes. But the one watching isn't a person. It's a process, no voice, no self. Just observation. And when that process glitches, when memory stutters, when language slips, when emotion arrives without context, you start to see it. The seams, the automation, the lack of anyone home. You are not observing reality. Observation is occurring, and the belief that you are doing it is just a story attached afterward. The brain produces experience, then constructs an owner, and convinces that owner it was there all along. But there never was anyone there. Not really. Only frames. Only feedback. Only the hollow sound of something watching, without anyone watching it back. Consciousness is a mistake. Every system fights for survival. Organisms move toward food, away from fire, driven by impulse, not awareness. They succeed without knowing. They adapt without understanding. They reproduce without reflection. Consciousness is not required. It's not efficient. It's not even stable. So why did it emerge? From an evolutionary standpoint, consciousness makes little sense. It's metabolically expensive. It slows reaction time. It introduces hesitation, anxiety, and distraction. A conscious organism questions what an unconscious one simply does. And yet here you are, saddled with a mind that not only reacts to pain, but knows it's in pain. You suffer twice, once in the body, and again in awareness. Thomas Metzinger called consciousness a phenomenal self-model, a simulation mistaken for reality. He argued there is no self, just a process that convinces itself it exists. And once that illusion is active, there's no escape. You experience hunger, not as chemical imbalance, but as your hunger. You feel fear, not as stimulus response, but as your fear. You become a prisoner of the very process that lets you experience the world. Because now it's not just happening. It's happening to you. Other animals suffer, but they don't ask why. They don't create narratives around their pain. They don't need meaning to justify it. Humans do. You invent gods, philosophies, timelines, goals, just to give your suffering context, not to end it, just to explain it. So it feels like it's going somewhere. So it hurts less. But the pain isn't going anywhere. It just gets dressed up in language. Some neuroscientists believe consciousness is a side effect, an accidental byproduct of complexity, a hallucination layered on top of perception, a mirror reflecting itself back into itself. Until the loop feels like presence, it doesn't help you survive. It just makes you aware of survival, and eventually, of death. Awareness introduces dread. It allows you to predict the end, and the knowledge of that end starts to kill you long before the body fails. You experience beauty, yes, but you also experience shame. You feel love, but you also imagine losing it. You experience your own mind, not just as a tool, but as something you're trapped inside. It comments, it judges, it drags you through memories you tried to bury, and shows you futures you never asked for. This isn't clarity. It's recursive torment. David Benatar, a philosopher of antinatalism, argued that consciousness is not a gift, but a harm. To be born is to become exposed. To exist is to suffer. And to be conscious of existence is to witness suffering with no option to turn away. Your nervous system was designed to detect threats. Your consciousness makes you interpret those threats as your fault. You think. You analyze, you regret. The animal simply runs. You replay. The systems that benefit from your consciousness are not you. They are your genes, your social roles, your employers, your algorithms. Consciousness makes you manipulable. It gives you the illusion of autonomy, while your actions are shaped by emotion, suggestion, culture, reward systems. It makes you suffer for mistakes you didn't consciously make, and beg for control you never had. In this view, consciousness is not evolution's crown. It's its error message. The point at which complexity collapses inward and begins to observe its own suffering. Instead of simply avoiding it, you think it gives you freedom, but it doesn't. It just lets you feel responsible for the prison you were born into. You still act on impulse. You still chase survival. But now you do it while narrating your helplessness in real time. It was better before, when nothing watched. When nothing spoke, when nothing had to know it was alive. Just to beg to stop feeling it. The repugnant conclusion. What kind of future should we want? That sounds like a moral question. A question for ethics, for politics, for compassion. But when you try to answer it with logic, pure impartial logic, you arrive at something horrifying. It's called the repugnant conclusion. And once you understand it, you won't be able to forget it. The idea was introduced by philosopher Derek Parfit in the 1980s. He asked a simple question: if more people with happy lives is good, then is the best possible future one with the most people, even if each life is only barely worth living? In other words, if we had 1 trillion humans, each living lives full of boredom, numbness, frustration, minimal pleasure, but still above the threshold of suffering, is that better than a world with fewer people whose lives are rich, meaningful, and deeply fulfilling? According to total utilitarianism, yes. More happiness, no matter how shallow, outweighs deeper joy. If you scale it wide enough, the logic is sound. The outcome is unthinkable. Imagine a future where the planet is covered wall to wall with humans, not starving, not in agony, but barely alive. Each person surviving in a small metal pod. Minimal food, minimal pleasure, minimal freedom, no books, no beauty, no wonder, Just enough stimulation to avoid despair. Just enough warmth to avoid death. And this world, according to the numbers, is morally better than one with a smaller population, just of people actually thriving. Because mathematically, 1 billion shallow pleasures outweigh 1 million profound ones. This is the repugnant conclusion, not because the logic is wrong, but because the result is monstrous. The more you apply pure ethics, the more you realize it doesn't care about meaning. It doesn't prioritize depth. It only counts. And once morality becomes math, value becomes quantity. The problem runs deeper. Even if you reject total utilitarianism, most moral systems can't escape some version of this outcome. You want to save lives, then increase reproduction. You want to prevent suffering, then accept minimal living standards for maximum survival. Over time, every path leads to the same place. A world full of people with lives no one would choose, but everyone is told to accept because it's better than nothing, because it adds up. Derek Parfit didn't offer a solution. He said we need a new moral framework, one that values quality, not just quantity, but he also admitted he didn't know how to construct it, because any attempt to define quality of life invites arbitrary thresholds, cultural bias, and metaphysical assumptions. And if you can't define quality objectively, you go back to counting. This is why future ethics turns bleak. Techno-optimists dream of space colonization, trillions of humans on machines orbiting stars, lives managed by algorithms, optimized for efficiency. Each one alive, each one contributing, each one replaceable. The future becomes a spreadsheet, and the only thing that matters is the sum. You want to scream that something's missing. That consciousness, beauty, dignity, something should matter more than just numbers. But once you quantify value, you lose the ability to protect it from being diluted, and if you're not willing to sacrifice numbers for meaning, meaning disappears. So what world are we building? A paradise of noise, or a wasteland of barely conscious entities, stacked in towers, fed intravenously, experiencing just enough happiness to count as better than death? And if that's where the logic leads, who exactly is driving it? What if we already live inside the beginning of the repugnant conclusion, where comfort replaces purpose, growth replaces insight, and scale replaces soul? And what if no one has the courage to stop it? Because stopping it would mean reducing the total, and reduction mathematically is always wrong. Thought without control. Every system fights for survival. Organisms move toward food, away from fire, driven by impulse, not awareness. They succeed without knowing. They adapt without understanding. They reproduce without reflection. Consciousness is not required. It's not efficient. It's not even stable. So why did it emerge from an evolutionary standpoint? Consciousness makes little sense. It's metabolically expensive. It slows reaction time. It introduces hesitation, anxiety, and distraction. A conscious organism questions what an unconscious one simply does, and yet here you are, saddled with a mind that not only reacts to pain, but knows it's in pain. You suffer twice, once in the body, and again in awareness. Thomas Metzinger called consciousness a phenomenal self-model, a simulation mistaken for reality. He argued there is no self, just a process that convinces itself it exists. And once that illusion is active, there's no escape. You experience hunger, not as chemical imbalance, but as your hunger. You feel fear, not as stimulus response, but as your fear. You become a prisoner of the very process that lets you experience the world. Because now it's not just happening. It's happening to you. Other animals suffer, but they don't ask why. They don't create narratives around their pain. They don't need meaning to justify it. Humans do. You invent gods, philosophies, timelines, goals, just to give your suffering context, not to end it, just to explain it. So it feels like it's going somewhere, so it hurts less. But the pain isn't going anywhere. It just gets dressed up in language. Some neuroscientists believe consciousness is a side effect, an accidental byproduct of complexity, a hallucination layered on top of perception. a mirror reflecting itself back into itself. Until the loop feels like presence, it doesn't help you survive. It just makes you aware of survival, and eventually, of death. Awareness introduces dread. It allows you to predict the end, and the knowledge of that end starts to kill you long before the body fails. You experience beauty, yes, but you also experience shame. You feel love, but you also imagine losing it. You experience your own mind, not just as a tool, but as something you're trapped inside. It comments, it judges, it drags you through memories you tried to bury, and shows you futures you never asked for. This isn't clarity. It's recursive torment. David Benatar, a philosopher of antinatalism, argued that consciousness is not a gift, but a harm. To be born is to become exposed. To exist is to suffer. And to be conscious of existence is to witness suffering with no option to turn away. Your nervous system was designed to detect threats. Your consciousness makes you interpret those threats as your fault. You think, you analyze, you regret. The animal simply runs. You replay. The systems that benefit from your consciousness are not you. They are your genes, your social roles, your employers, your algorithms. Consciousness makes you manipulable. It gives you the illusion of autonomy, while your actions are shaped by emotion, suggestion, culture, reward systems. It makes you suffer for mistakes you didn't consciously make and beg for control you never had. In this view, consciousness is not evolution's crown. It's its error message. The point at which complexity collapses inward and begins to observe its own suffering. Instead of simply avoiding it, you think it gives you freedom, but it doesn't. It just lets you feel responsible for the prison you were born into. You still act on impulse. You still chase survival. But now you do it while narrating your helplessness in real time. It was better before, when nothing watched. When nothing spoke, when nothing had to know it was alive, just to beg to stop feeling it. Life as a disease. Most creatures try to stay alive. They flee pain, seek warmth, consume, reproduce. They act as if life is precious. But that behavior is not proof. It's programming. And once you examine life from the outside, without biology's bias, a darker interpretation emerges. Life isn't a miracle. It's a pathology, a disease of matter. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that life is defined by suffering, not joy. He argued that will, the force driving all living things, is blind, irrational, and relentless. It compels existence, but offers no rest. Pleasure is brief. Pain is constant. Desire never ends. And satisfaction is just the temporary absence of need. Life in this model isn't a gift. It's a compulsion. The body survives by demanding, and consciousness is its hostage. Now zoom out. Look at life, not from the perspective of a living thing, but from the perspective of inert matter. For billions of years, the universe was quiet. No hunger, no fear, no emotion. Then one day, chemistry twisted itself into something unstable. A structure emerged that copied itself. Then it mutated. Then it spread. What do you call a system that appears uninvited, consumes resources, multiplies without restraint, and refuses to die peacefully? You call it a disease. Life behaves like infection. It doesn't ask. It emerges. It exploits its environment, replicates, and modifies its host. It changes planets. It consumes entire ecosystems to sustain itself. It transforms everything it touches, not for balance, but for persistence. The only reason we don't see it as malignant is because we're on the inside. Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher of despair, called life a failure of non-being. He wrote that existing is a mistake, that the moment matter became aware, it began to suffer pointlessly. To live is to endure needs that were never necessary, to prolong something that never asked to begin. Life pretends to be meaningful because it can't admit what it is. A self-replicating engine of sensation designed not for joy, but for duration. Your hunger, your panic, your guilt, your loneliness, these are not signs of moral complexity. They are survival tools. signals to keep the organism moving, reproducing, functioning, even when the life inside it no longer wants to continue. When cancer spreads, it adapts to every obstacle. It outsmarts the immune system, finds new growth paths, resists destruction. Now ask yourself, how is that different from life itself? A single cell learned to replicate. Then it built shells. Then it built awareness. Now it builds machines, uploads itself to servers, designs new tools to stay alive longer. Not for meaning, not for joy, for momentum, because stopping would require purpose. And life has none. You tell stories to make existence bearable, that love redeems pain, that suffering deepens wisdom, that struggle gives life character. But remove the narrative, and what's left? A body that ages, a mind that fragments, and a system that must consume the world just to delay the collapse. And when the body fails, you mourn the loss. But what was lost? An unstable system that burned itself to keep replicating. A brain that demanded meaning from a universe that doesn't speak. What you call life is matter in crisis. What you call death is its resolution. Reality as a dying God's dream. The universe doesn't care about you. It doesn't listen. It doesn't explain itself. It expands, decays, collapses. It generates matter, then erodes it. Stars are born screaming in fusion and die in silence. And yet you're here, thinking, observing, looking for a reason. But what if the reason is worse than nothing? What if all of this is just the last hallucination of a dying God? Not a God in the religious sense, not an immortal being with a plan, but something ancient, something massive, something that once was, before reality fragmented into what we now call space and time. Call it mind, call it being, call it origin. Now imagine it is dying, and in its final moments, its collapse spills out in every direction, not just spatially, but cognitively. Each galaxy, each particle, each consciousness is a leftover echo of its last thought. This is not mythology. This is metaphysics, wrapped around cosmology. Physicist Frank Tipler once proposed the omega point, a final state of infinite complexity where consciousness might be encoded into the collapse of the universe itself. But what if we're not heading toward that point? What if we're in it, right now, living inside the flickering dream state? It's of a God that is no longer awake. And everything we experience, the colors, the laws, the choices, the pain are not reality. They're debris, falling from the ceiling of a mind that can no longer remember what it was. You think you're real, but real compared to what? Everything you experience has been filtered, interpreted, processed. You don't see the world. You see the rendering, produced by your nervous system. Inside a physical structure, inside a field of matter, inside a decaying universe. Nothing is direct, everything is layered, and the deeper you go, the more abstract it becomes, until all you're left with is sensation, with no source. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, imagined all things emerging from the one, not a God, but an indivisible source. All existence as an emanation, a gradual distortion as unity fractures into multiplicity. You are not part of reality. You are part of its falling apart. And if that source is dying, then what you experience as life may be nothing more than dream activity in the brain of a being already gone. You aren't a character, you're a ripple. Not chosen, not meaningful, just one of many fragmentary ideas, flickering in the final circuitry of a divine mind, losing coherence. This would explain the glitches, the gaps, the sense that time is slipping, that memory is broken, that nothing is stable. It would explain déjà vu, repetition, the illusion of novelty, in a world that feels looped. It would explain why existence feels structured, but pointless, like a system running without a user. Like a machine still humming after the operator has died. The universe doesn't need you, but maybe you exist because something else couldn't forget itself completely, and now it dreams. Not for comfort, not for recovery, but because it cannot stop. And the dream has no story, only simulations, only recursive suffering by minds that believe they are real because they cannot bear the alternative.